Hello friends, I'm here to help you relax tonight. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'd love to know. Now get comfortable, let go of the day's worries, and let this story guide you to a calm, peaceful sleep. You deserve to feel at ease, leaving all the stress behind. Subscribe now and join me for more stories to help you find peace. The wind howled through the cracks in the old wooden cabin, each gust rattling the brittle glass windows as if begging to come inside. Sam tightened his grip on the flashlight, the beam flickering weakly against the oppressive darkness. He hated coming here, always had. But tonight there wasn't a choice. The first sign something was wrong came hours earlier when the landline rang. Who even called landlines anymore? Sam hesitated before picking up, his heart already uneasy. "Don't go to the cabin," a voice whispered, low and urgent. Then silence. Sam had barely managed a word before the line went dead. The number was unlisted, and despite his better judgment, he felt compelled to check the cabin. It had been in his family for generations, abandoned now, but it held the weight of memories and secrets too old to recall clearly. He told himself it was just curiosity, or maybe responsibility, that pulled him there, but deep down he knew it was fear. Fear that the voice on the phone might have been right. The cabin sat on the edge of the woods, far enough from town that no one would hear you scream. Sam parked his car at the overgrown trailhead, the headlights slicing through the darkness. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as he stepped out and felt the damp crunch of leaves beneath his boots. His chest tightened. The moment he reached the front door, he knew something was wrong. The lock, rusted and stiff from years of neglect, hung open as if someone had broken in, or worse, been waiting. Sam pushed the door open, his flashlight cutting through the dust-filled air inside. The familiar smell of rotting wood and mildew hit him like a wave, but something else lingered beneath it, a faint metallic tang like blood. He stepped inside, each creak of the wooden floorboards beneath his weight echoing in the stillness. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, twisting and shifting like they had lives of their own. The flashlight flickered again, and Sam cursed under his breath, shaking it to keep the beam steady. He wasn't alone here. He could feel it. In the living room, the furniture lay as it always had, untouched for years. A threadbare couch, a coffee table stacked with yellowed magazines, and a television so old it could have been an antique. But something was off. On the coffee table was a notebook he didn't recognize. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages peeked out, filled with something scribbled in a frantic hand. Sam hesitated before picking it up. The writing was erratic, almost unreadable, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over on every page. "The woods watch at night." The word sent a chill crawling up his spine. He dropped the notebook as if it burned him, the pages fluttering open to reveal a sketch. It was crude, childlike, but unmistakable. A figure stood among the trees, tall and impossibly thin, with long clawed fingers and hollow eyes. A sharp creak behind him snapped Sam out of his trance. He whipped around, the flashlight jerking wildly in the dark. "Hello?" His voice barely carried, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Nothing answered. But in the beam of his flashlight, he saw it, barely more than a fleeting shadow slipping past the doorway to the hall. Sam's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. It could have been an animal, maybe even a squatter. But he knew better. There was something in the way it moved, unnatural and deliberate, like it wanted him to follow. And against every ounce of logic screaming at him to leave, he did. The hallway stretched longer than he remembered, the shadows deeper. His footsteps felt muffled, like the air had thickened. Halfway down, a faint noise reached his ears, a low, wet, dragging sound, growing louder the closer he got to the last door. The door to the basement. Sam stopped in front of it, every instinct in his body telling him to run. But instead, his hand reached for the doorknob, trembling. It felt icy cold under his palm. He twisted it slowly, the door creaking open to reveal a staircase descending into pure blackness. The dragging sound stopped. "Who's down there?" he called, his voice cracking. No answer. But then, faintly, something whispered from the darkness below. "Come closer." Sam's pulse hammered in his ears as the whispered words echoed up the staircase. The voice was faint but chilling, as though it had been carried on a wind that shouldn't exist. He leaned forward, his flashlight beam barely penetrating the heavy darkness below. "Who's there?" he demanded again, trying to sound firm, though his voice betrayed his fear. Silence. Then, faintly, the dragging sound resumed. It wasn't coming up the stairs, it was circling, moving deeper into the basement like something taunting him to follow. He turned slowly, his stomach dropping. The darkness felt alive now, wrapping around him, closing in. And in that suffocating void, two hollow eyes blinked open, staring back at him. Sam didn't have time to think. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. He grabbed the nearest object, an old rusted lamp from the table, and swung it blindly into the darkness. The crash echoed through the room, but it didn't matter. Whatever stood before him didn't flinch, didn't even move. The hollow eyes stared, unblinking, their faint, otherworldly glow the only light in the room. Sam's breath hitched, his legs refusing to move as fear rooted him to the spot. Then, slowly, the creature took a step forward. "Stay back," Sam shouted, his voice cracking. He swung the lamp again, the heavy bass cutting through the air, but the figure dissolved into the shadows. For a moment there was silence. Sam's chest heaved as his eyes darted around the room, desperate for a sign of where it had gone. The darkness pressed against him, thick and oppressive, and then he felt it, cold breath on the back of his neck. Sam whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the same crushing blackness. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice shaking. A low, guttural laugh filled the room, echoing off the walls. It wasn't human, it was layered, distorted, as if multiple voices spoke at once. "You don't belong here," the voice said, the words dragging out unnaturally, like it was savoring every syllable. Sam's knees buckled and he fell to the floor. His hands scrambled across the carpet, searching for the flashlight, but his fingers found only the smooth, cold surface of the notebook. The pages rustled, though there was no wind. Sam's eyes widened as he saw the words appearing on their own, written in that same frantic hand. "Run. It's already too late." The laugh grew louder, filling the room as if the walls themselves were mocking him. Sam clutched the notebook to his chest and stumbled to his feet, his only thought now to get out. He bolted for the front door, the shadows seeming to shift and reach for him as he passed. His hands fumbled with the lock, and for a moment he thought he wouldn't make it. But then the bolt slid free and the door flew open. Cold night air hit his face like a slap, and Sam ran. He didn't look back, didn't dare glance at the cabin as he sprinted down the overgrown trail toward his car. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together to block out the moonlight. The woods were silent, unnaturally so. No wind, no animals, just the sound of his pounding footsteps and ragged breaths. But as he neared the car, a new sound reached his ears, soft at first but growing louder. It was the dragging again. Sam's heart leaped into his throat as he turned, his flashlight catching glimpses of movement between the trees. Long, thin limbs darting in and out of the shadows, circling him. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, no, no." He reached the car and yanked the door open, throwing himself inside. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, the dragging sound now right outside. He could feel it pressing against the car, surrounding him. The engine roared to life and Sam slammed his foot on the gas. The tires skidded on the dirt road before finding traction, and the car shot forward. He gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The woods stretched out behind him, but something moved in the darkness. A shape, tall and thin, running faster than anything human should. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, growing brighter the closer it came. Sam's foot pressed harder on the pedal, the car lurching as the speedometer climbed. He didn't dare look back again, focusing instead on the road ahead. The trees whipped past in a blur, and for a moment he thought he might make it. Then the headlights flickered. "No, no, come on," Sam shouted, slamming his fist against the dashboard. The lights sputtered, dimmed, then went out completely. The car plunged into darkness and Sam's stomach twisted. He couldn't see the road, couldn't see the trees, couldn't see anything. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. For a moment there was silence. Sam gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he stared into the pitch-black void. Then a hand slammed against the window. Sam screamed, his flashlight tumbling from the passenger seat as the glass cracked under the force. The hand was impossibly long, its fingers tipped with sharp, claw-like nails that scraped against the window. "Let me in," the voice whispered right outside the glass. Sam fumbled for the flashlight, his fingers brushing against it just as the window shattered. The creature's hand shot inside, clawing at him as he twisted away. The notebook fell from his lap, landing open on the passenger seat. New words filled the page, glowing faintly in the darkness. It never lets you leave. Sam's scream echoed through the woods as the hand closed around his arm, pulling him into the darkness. Sam woke to silence. No sound of birds, no rustling leaves, not even the faint hum of insects. Just an oppressive, heavy quiet that pressed against his ears. His head throbbed, and when he tried to move, a sharp pain shot through his arm. He groaned, blinking slowly as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. He wasn't in the car anymore. The walls surrounding him were rough, made of cold, damp stone. A faint flicker of light illuminated the space, coming from a single guttering candle placed on the floor. Its weak flame cast long shadows that danced and twisted unnaturally along the walls. Sam's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. Across the room, hunched in the corner, was the figure. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, fixed on him. It didn't move, but the air seemed to ripple around it, like heat rising off asphalt. Sam tried to speak, but his voice came out hoarse and broken. What do you want?" The creature tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate. Its limbs creaked like ancient wood, and when it finally spoke, its voice was low and grating, as if dragged from the depths of the earth. "You trespassed," it said. Sam's mind raced, searching for an explanation, a way out. I didn't mean to. I got a call." The creature's laugh cut him off, sharp and hollow. "A call?" it echoed, mocking. "You were warned, and still you came?" Sam's pulse quickened. "What are you? Why are you doing this to me?" The creature didn't answer immediately. It began to move, its long, spindly limbs unfolding as it rose to its full height. Sam pressed himself against the wall, his body trembling. "Do you think you're the first?" it asked, its voice almost a whisper now, dripping with malice. "This place has always belonged to me. And those who come, they don't leave." Sam's eyes darted around the room, searching for any possible escape. There was no door, no window, just the stone walls and the faint circle of light cast by the candle. His heart sank as he realized the only way out was past the creature. "You don't have to do this," Sam pleaded, his voice shaking. "I'll leave. I won't come back. I swear." The creature stepped closer, its movements unnervingly smooth, as if it were gliding rather than walking. "You already belong to me," it hissed. "But you'll see. They all see." Sam didn't wait to find out what that meant. He grabbed the candle, ignoring the sting of hot wax on his fingers, and hurled it at the creature. The flame sputtered out as it hit, plunging the room into total darkness. The creature let out a guttural roar, and Sam seized the moment. He scrambled to his feet, feeling along the walls for any crack, any opening. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. A handle. Without thinking, he yanked it. A hidden door groaned open, and Sam didn't hesitate. He ran, the air growing colder with each step. The narrow passage twisted and turned, the darkness so complete he couldn't tell if he was moving forward or in circles. Behind him, the creature's voice echoed, growing louder. "You can't run. You can't hide." Sam's lungs burned as he pushed himself faster, his hands outstretched to keep from slamming into the walls. The floor beneath him shifted, the rough stone giving way to damp earth. And then he saw it, a faint light ahead, cutting through the black. Hope surged in his chest as he stumbled toward it, the creature's voice fading behind him. The passage opened up into the woods, the moonlight casting an eerie glow over the trees. Sam didn't stop to catch his breath. He ran, branches tearing at his clothes, his legs screaming in protest. But the woods felt endless. No matter how far he went, the trees seemed to stretch on forever, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. And then he saw them. Figures stood among the trees, their faces pale and blank, their eyes glowing faintly like the creature's. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but their presence was suffocating. Sam slowed, his chest heaving. He turned in a circle, realizing he was surrounded. The figures watched him silently, their hollow gazes piercing through the night. One of them stepped forward. It was a woman, her features faintly familiar. Sam's stomach twisted as recognition dawned. It was his mother. But that was impossible. She had died years ago, long before Sam had ever come to the cabin. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The woman tilted her head, just like the creature had, and her lips parted. "Why did you leave us?" she asked, her voice echoing unnaturally. Sam stumbled back, shaking his head. "You're not real. You can't be real." The figures began to move then, closing in, their steps slow and deliberate. Sam's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening, but the fear was too great. "Leave me alone," he screamed, his voice cracking. The woman's face twisted into a grotesque smile. "You'll stay here, just like the others." Sam turned and ran, his heart pounding. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. The figures' voices followed him, overlapping in a cacophony of whispers and laughter. "You can't leave," they said over and over. "You belong to the woods now." Sam's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground, the whispers closing in around him. His vision blurred, the trees spinning above him. And then, just as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, he saw it. A light, bright and warm, cutting through the black. Sam squinted against the light, his body frozen with exhaustion and terror. The brightness pulsed, not like a flashlight or fire, but something alive, shimmering, shifting as if it were breathing. He crawled toward it, every movement slow and labored, the whispers still swirling around him like a suffocating fog. His fingers dug into the damp earth as he dragged himself forward, closer to the warmth of the light. And then, as he reached the edge of the clearing, the light flickered, revealing something, or someone, standing at its center. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown that clung to her frame. Her face was obscured by the veil of her unkempt hair, but her posture was unnervingly still, as though she were waiting for him. Sam hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But behind him, the whispers grew louder, closer. He could feel the icy breath of the figures at his back. There was no other option. "Help me," Sam croaked, his voice barely audible. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she raised a hand, her bony fingers pointing to the space beside her. Sam followed the gesture and froze. There, at her feet, was the notebook. The same one he'd taken from the cabin. "No," Sam whispered, shaking his head. "No, I left that behind." The woman tilted her head slightly, the movement jerky and unnatural. Her voice, when it came, was soft but piercing, like a blade sliding into his mind. "You shouldn't have taken it." Sam's stomach dropped. He glanced back, the glowing eyes of the figures now visible between the trees. They were closing in, their hands outstretched, their whispers growing into an eerie chant. "You shouldn't have taken it." The woman took a step forward, her feet not disturbing the earth beneath her. "It's not yours. It was never yours." Sam scrambled to his feet, his body trembling. I didn't know what it was." The woman stopped, her face still obscured, and for a moment, everything went silent. The whispers, the figures, the strange pulsing light, all of it ceased. Then her voice rang out again, sharp and commanding. "Return it." Sam stared at the notebook, his breath hitching. He didn't want to touch it, didn't want to feel the cold, unnatural weight of it in his hands again. But the figures were so close now, their glowing eyes piercing into him, their twisted faces filled with hunger. He had no choice. Slowly he reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cover. The moment he made contact, the ground beneath him seemed to shift, and the world tilted violently. The clearing disappeared. Sam found himself standing back in the cabin, the notebook clutched tightly to his chest. The air was thick and suffocating, the shadows on the walls alive with movement. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, I left this place." But the cabin didn't care. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the oppressive darkness pressed in closer. Sam felt the weight of the notebook in his hands, heavier than before, as if it were alive. The pages began to flip on their own, faster and faster, until they stopped on a blank page. Words began to scrawl across it in the same frantic, jagged handwriting as before. "The debt must be paid." "What debt?" Sam shouted, his voice echoing in the empty room. "What do you want from me?" The shadows on the walls twisted, forming shapes that were almost human but not quite. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly as they stared at him, unblinking. "You took what wasn't yours," one of them said, its voice like the creak of an old door. Sam shook his head, clutching the notebook tighter. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The shadows moved closer, their shapes flickering like dying flames. "Intentions don't matter," they said in unison. "Only actions." The notebook grew heavier in Sam's hands, the cover burning cold against his skin. He tried to drop it, but his fingers wouldn't obey. The book seemed to cling to him, an extension of his very being. "Please," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Please just let me go." The shadows paused, their flickering forms growing taller, more imposing. Then one of them stepped forward, its hollow eyes boring into Sam's soul. "There is a way," it said, its voice softer now, almost kind. Sam's breath hitched. "What way? Tell me." The shadow extended a hand, long and clawed, pointing to the notebook. "Right?" Sam stared at the book, his mind racing. "Right what?" The shadow's smile was barely perceptible, a faint curl of its jagged, inhuman mouth. "Your story." Sam's heart pounded. "What does that mean?" "I don't understand." But the shadow didn't answer. It simply stepped back, merging into the others. The walls of the cabin began to shift, the room growing darker and colder with each passing moment. The notebook trembled in Sam's hands, the blank page before him waiting, expectant. Sam swallowed hard, his fingers trembling as he gripped the pen that seemed to appear out of nowhere. He didn't want to write, didn't want to know what would happen if he did. But the shadows were closing in, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. With a shaking hand, he pressed the pen to the page. Sam's hand trembled as he pressed the pen to the blank page. The ink began to flow, seemingly of its own accord, black and thick against the pale paper. At first, he hesitated, the tip of the pen hovering above the page, unsure of what to write. But then the whispers grew louder. The shadows pressed closer, their cold, unnatural presence crawling over his skin. They didn't need to speak, their intent was clear. "Right?" Sam swallowed hard, his breath shallow. The pen moved, his hand guided by a force he couldn't control. "I don't know where it started. Maybe the cabin. Maybe earlier." The words spilled onto the page, faster than his mind could process. It wasn't his voice, not entirely. Something else was pushing through, weaving his thoughts into sentences that he didn't consciously form. "I thought it was just a trip, a chance to reconnect. But I was wrong. It was never about me. It was about them." Sam's heart pounded as the shadows around him seemed to react to the words. They shifted and swayed, their forms growing sharper, more distinct. Faces began to emerge, faces he recognized. There was the old man from the gas station, his eyes hollow and accusing. The woman from the woods, her white gown stained with something dark and unnameable. And then, his mother. Her face was clearer now, no longer obscured by shadows. But it wasn't the face he remembered. Her features were gaunt, her skin stretched too tight over her bones, and her eyes were filled with something that made his stomach turn, something hungry. "Mom?" Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. She didn't answer. She didn't move. But her presence was suffocating, her gaze fixed on the notebook in his hands. The pen kept moving. "I tried to leave, but the woods wouldn't let me. The cabin wouldn't let me. They're all connected, all part of something bigger." The air in the room grew colder, the shadows pressing closer. Sam felt the weight of their expectation, the demand for more. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The shadows didn't respond, but the notebook did. The words on the page twisted and shifted, rearranging themselves into a single chilling sentence. "The truth will set you free." Sam's breath hitched. "What truth? What are you talking about?" The pen moved again, this time without his hand guiding it. The ink bled onto the page, forming words that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. "Tell them. All of it. Or they'll take you." Sam's chest tightened. The meaning was clear. He had to write everything, the story, the secrets, the horrors he had seen. But there was something else, something unspoken, lingering in the shadows. "They'll take me if I don't?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The shadows didn't answer. Instead, the notebook began to glow faintly, the words on the page illuminating the room with an eerie light. Sam clenched his jaw and continued to write. It wasn't just me. They were there too. The others. The ones who came before. They left their mark, carved into the walls, hidden in the whispers. They warned me, but I didn't listen. I thought I could outrun it. I was wrong. As Sam wrote, memories began to flood his mind. Memories he didn't recognize. Faces of people he had never met, places he had never been. They felt real, though, as if he had lived them all. He saw a man in a tattered coat, his hands bloodied as he scratched symbols into the cabin walls. He saw a woman screaming, her face twisted in terror as the shadows consumed her. He saw a child, standing alone in the woods, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The pen moved faster, the words pouring out in a torrent. It's not just the cabin. It's the woods, the trees, The ground itself. It's alive. It watches. It waits. The shadows around him grew restless, their forms shifting and writhing. Sam could feel their eyes on him, their silent judgment weighing heavy on his soul. He paused, his hand cramping from the effort. Is this enough? Is this what you wanted? The notebook didn't answer, but the shadows did. One of them stepped forward, its form more solid than the others. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it loomed over him. Its face was a void, featureless and empty, yet Sam could feel its gaze piercing through him. Not enough, it said, its voice a low growl that vibrated through the room. Sam's heart sank. He looked down at the notebook, the blank pages that seemed to stretch on forever. He didn't know how much more he could give, how much more he could remember. But he had no choice. He wrote about the voices in the woods, the calls that lured him deeper. He wrote about the cabin, the feeling of being watched, the symbols carved into its walls. He wrote about the notebook itself, the way it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And then, without warning, the pen stopped. Sam stared at the page, the final words glistening wetly in the dim light. It doesn't end here. The notebook snapped shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. The shadows froze, their forms flickering uncertainly. What now? Sam whispered, his voice trembling. The tallest shadow tilted its head, its featureless face somehow managing to convey a sense of cruel amusement. You'll see, it said. And then the cabin was gone. Sam was standing in the woods again, the notebook still clutched tightly in his hands. The trees loomed around him, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the starless sky. But something was different. The woods were silent. Completely, utterly silent. And then he heard it, a single, faint voice carried on the wind. Right? The voice cut through the silence like a razor, soft yet relentless. Right? Sam stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. He turned slowly, scanning the dark woods, but there was no one there, just the skeletal trees and the crushing stillness that pressed down on him like a weight. Who's there? He called out, his voice breaking. The only answer was the whisper, closer now, surrounding him. Right? Sam's grip on the notebook tightened. He wanted to throw it away, to hurl it into the shadows and run until his legs gave out. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it wouldn't work. The notebook would find its way back to him. It always did. He glanced down at it, the cover cold against his palms. Slowly he opened it. The pages were blank again, but the weight of the book felt heavier, more oppressive. What do you want me to write? He asked, his voice trembling. The wind picked up, carrying with it a chorus of whispers, overlapping and chaotic. But within the cacophony, one word stood out. Everything. Sam's knees buckled and he sank to the ground. I don't know everything. I don't even know what's happening to me. The whispers grew louder, angrier. The trees seemed to close in, their branches stretching toward him like claws. The notebook vibrated in his hands, the pages flipping wildly until they stopped on a single line of text, scrawled in jagged, dripping ink. Remember? Sam's vision blurred, his mind spinning as fragments of memory crashed over him like a tidal wave. They weren't just his memories, they couldn't be. They were too vast, too ancient. He saw flashes of people he didn't know, places he'd never been, horrors he couldn't comprehend. A village consumed by fire, the screams of its inhabitants echoing into the night. A man standing in a circle of candles, chanting words that twisted the air around him. A child with empty eyes, staring into the void as the ground split open beneath her feet. And through it all, the notebook was there, passed from hand to hand, its presence like a shadow that couldn't be escaped. No, Sam whispered, clutching his head. This isn't real. It can't be real. But the memories kept coming, more vivid, more relentless. He saw himself now, walking into the woods, finding the cabin, picking up the notebook. He saw the symbols carved into the walls, the warnings he had ignored. He saw the shadows watching, waiting. And then he saw something else, something worse. A figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a hood. But its presence was unmistakable. It had been there all along, watching him, guiding him. Who are you? Sam whispered, the words barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing directly at him. Sam's chest tightened as the whispers grew deafening, swirling around him in a vortex of sound and shadow. The notebook burned in his hands, the ink bleeding through the pages as words appeared. one after another, too fast for him to read. "What do you want from me?" Sam screamed, his voice cracking. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. When it spoke, its voice was low and resonant, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You already know." Sam shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I don't. I swear I don't." The figure stopped a few feet away, its hooded face tilting slightly. "Then write. And you will." The notebook seemed to pull at him, drawing him in, demanding his attention. Sam stared at the blank page, his vision swimming. He didn't know what to write, but his hand moved anyway, the pen pressing against the paper as if guided by an unseen force. "It's always been there," he wrote, the words coming unbidden. "The thing in the woods. The thing that watches. It doesn't just want me, it wants everyone." As the words appeared on the page, the forest around him seemed to shift. The trees groaned and twisted, their bark splitting open to reveal glowing symbols that matched the ones in the cabin. Sam's breath hitched. "What is this? What does it mean?" The figure didn't answer. It simply pointed at the notebook, its silent command clear. Sam's hand moved again, the pen scratching across the page. "The notebook isn't just a record. It's a key. A door. And I've opened it." The moment the last word was written, the ground beneath him trembled. The symbols on the trees pulsed with light, and the whispers reached a fever pitch. Sam clutched the notebook to his chest, his heart pounding. "What's happening?" The hooded figure stepped back, its form dissolving into the shadows. "You're beginning to understand," it said, its voice echoing in the darkness. The ground split open beneath Sam, and he fell, the notebook slipping from his grasp. Sam hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He was in a different place now, a vast, cavernous space lit by an unnatural red glow. The air was thick and heavy, and the walls were covered in the same glowing symbols he had seen in the forest. In the center of the cavern stood an altar, and on it rested the notebook, its pages fluttering in an unseen wind. Sam crawled toward it, his body aching. The whispers were louder here, almost deafening, but they didn't feel random anymore. They were forming words, sentences, commands. "Finish it," they said. "Finish what you started." Sam reached the altar, his fingers brushing against the notebook. The moment he touched it, a searing pain shot through his body and the whispers stopped. The cavern fell silent, and Sam looked up to see the hooded figure standing across from him. "It's your story now," the figure said, its voice softer, almost human. Sam stared at the notebook, the final blank page waiting for him. He didn't know what would happen if he wrote, but he knew he had no choice. With trembling hands, he picked up the pen and began to write. The moment Sam wrote, everything shifted. The words he scribbled on the page felt like they were etched in stone, like they could never be undone. The pen moved faster than he could process, as though something inside him, something ancient, was taking over. His heart raced in his chest, but there was no turning back now. He stared at the words forming on the page. "I'm not alone. They are all here with me." The cavern around him seemed to pulse, the red glow deepening, casting long, twisted shadows that stretched across the walls. The whispers that had been quiet for a moment began again, this time in an almost maddening chorus, overlapping, speaking in tongues. He could feel them all around him, their presence suffocating. The notebook began to glow, the pages shimmering with an eerie light. Sam couldn't tear his eyes away. The glow intensified, and the voices grew louder, until they felt like they were inside his head. "Write, write, or they will take you." He felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. His spine stiffened. A hand, icy and unseen, rested gently on his shoulder, sending a shock of terror down his spine. The whispering voices were no longer just around him. They were inside him. Sam fought to hold on to his sense of self, but the force within him grew stronger, urging him to write faster, more desperately. His hand didn't obey him anymore. It moved by itself, his fingers tightening around the pen. "The darkness is not outside. It's inside. It always has been." The words appeared on the page with such urgency that they felt like they were burning through the paper. Sam's vision blurred as his mind began to unravel. The shadows around him seemed to come alive, swirling in and out of the walls, their forms flickering between reality and nightmare. Faces, familiar faces, emerged from the dark, their hollow eyes locked on him with a vacant, predatory stare. "Do you see them? They're watching. Always watching." His breath caught in his throat. The faces in the shadows were no longer just figments of his imagination. They were real, too real. He could see them clearly now, the people who had disappeared before him, their twisted expressions of pain and hunger. Each one had been consumed by the darkness, their bodies half-formed, their eyes hollowed out. He staggered backward, but his feet didn't move as they should. The ground beneath him had turned to quicksand, sucking him deeper into its hold. His body was trapped, unable to move. The notebook remained open in his hands, the pages turning on their own, urging him forward. "It's your fault," the voices whispered. "You brought them here. You opened the door." Sam could feel their fingers brushing against him, their cold, skeletal hands crawling over his skin. The fear paralyzed him, but the pen kept moving, writing on its own, as if the story was writing itself, as if he was no longer in control. The cabin is a prison. The woods are its walls. And the book is its key. But it's more than a key. It's a trap. It has always been a trap. Suddenly, the faces surrounding him began to speak. They spoke in whispers, their words harsh and fragmented, but Sam could make out their meaning. "You're here because of the book? It was always the book. It was always watching, waiting. The woods were never empty. They were filled with us, with those who failed." Sam's head spun. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The cavern seemed to press in on him, growing smaller with every passing second. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He could only see the words that bled from the pages of the notebook, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The shadows began to close in, their forms twisting and contorting, becoming something monstrous, something that didn't resemble humanity at all. Their faces, those hollow, broken faces, twisted into grotesque masks of pain and anguish. Sam reached out, desperate to escape, but the shadows reached back. They surrounded him, their cold hands pulling at his limbs, dragging him deeper into the abyss. His body felt heavy, his mind sluggish, as if the weight of the book was draining the very life from him. "It was never supposed to be you," a voice whispered in his ear, its breath hot and rancid. "But you couldn't stop. You couldn't leave. You chose the book, Sam. You chose it. And now we are all part of it." The words on the page shifted again. Sam could feel them, could sense them growing stronger with each passing second. He knew what he had to do, but he didn't want to. "Write the end," the voice urged. "Write the end of it all, or you will never leave." Sam's hand moved, the pen scratching the paper with a noise that sent a shiver down his spine. But this time the pen didn't stop. The words bled from the pages, one after another, without his control. They filled the cavern, enveloping everything in their dark, suffocating presence. The story never ends. Suddenly everything froze. The shadows stopped moving. The cavern became still. The air itself seemed to hang in limbo, thick and unbreathing. Sam blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was awake anymore or if he was trapped within the pages of the story itself. Then from the silence came a single chilling sound, a laugh. It was hollow, empty. The kind of laugh that sent a chill straight into the marrow of your bones. Sam's eyes snapped toward the source of the sound. The figure in the hood had returned. It stood across from him, its face still hidden in shadow. But this time there was something different in its presence, something darker, more alive. "You thought you could finish it," the figure said, its voice mocking. "You thought you could stop it. But the story never ends, Sam. It never ends." The notebook burned in Sam's hands, the pages disintegrating into ash, scattering into the air like dust. The cavern around him began to crumble, the ground splitting open. And all around him, the voices rose again, louder this time, echoing in the dark, laughing as they encircled him. He had no more time. The ground beneath Sam trembled violently, and with a deafening crack, the cavern split open, swallowing him whole. He fell, and it felt as though he was falling for eternity. His body was weightless, suspended in a dark void where there was no up, no down, no direction. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against him like 100 invisible hands. Sam gasped for breath, but the void didn't allow for it. It absorbed every sound, every sensation, leaving him floating in a silence so profound, it felt like his own existence was being erased. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fall stopped. Sam hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud, his body crumpling into the dirt. His mind, dazed and disoriented, struggled to comprehend what was happening. The world around him was unfamiliar. It wasn't the cavern anymore. This place was worse, older. The air was colder, thick with the scent of decay. He pushed himself up, his hands shaking as he brushed the dirt from his clothes. The landscape around him was a desolate, barren wasteland. The ground was cracked and parched as if it hadn't seen rain in centuries. Dead trees reached toward the sky like twisted fingers, their branches gnarled and broken. The sky above was an oppressive, swirling mass of black clouds, casting everything in a muted, gray light. The whispers were here, too, louder than ever, seeping from every crack in the earth, every crevice in the air. "You're here." The words echoed, disembodied, crawling into his mind like spiders on the hunt. Sam looked around, panic rising in his chest. Where was he? How had he gotten here? Was this real? He stumbled forward, his legs weak, his every step heavy as if the very earth was trying to pull him back down. The whispers followed, relentless, gnawing at his sanity. They were too much to ignore, too much to bear. "It's never over." The words came from behind him, from the darkness of the trees. Sam spun around, but there was no one there, just the barren landscape stretching endlessly before him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't lose control now. If he did, the darkness would consume him completely. He had to keep moving, had to find a way out of this place. As he walked, the earth beneath him seemed to shift. The ground pulsed like it had a heartbeat of its own. And with each pulse, the whispers grew louder, sharper, more insistent. Suddenly, the air around him grew colder. He shivered, his breath visible in the chilling air. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead, moving with an unnatural grace. Its form was cloaked, its face hidden beneath a hood. The figure stepped forward, its presence sending a shock of recognition through Sam's mind. He knew it, he knew this figure even if he couldn't remember how. "You," Sam said, his voice hoarse. "You're the one from the forest. From the cabin." The figure didn't answer. It simply raised a hand, pointing toward the horizon. Sam followed the gesture and his blood ran cold. In the distance he could see something that shouldn't be there. A massive structure, half-formed as though it was still being built. But it wasn't a building. It was a doorway. A door to nowhere. The whispers grew frantic, their voices overlapping in a maddening chorus. Sam's heart raced. He didn't know what the door led to, but he felt an overwhelming pull, a need to get to it, to understand it, to face it. "Where is this place?" Sam demanded. "What is this?" The figure didn't speak, but the air around Sam seemed to respond. The whispers paused, and in the silence that followed, a single word echoed in his mind. "Home." Sam's head spun, the word striking him like a blow. "Oh, this was home?" He shook his head, unable to process what he was hearing. The figure had started to walk toward the door, moving with eerie purpose. Sam followed, his footsteps echoing in the dead silence. As he neared the doorway, he could feel it, the pull, the magnetic force that seemed to draw him in. The door was old, ancient even, its surface covered in the same symbols he had seen before. The same symbols from the notebook, from the woods, from the walls of the cabin. He reached out to touch it, but before his fingers made contact, a voice stopped him. "You can't leave." Sam froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to look, but the figure was gone. He stood alone in the barren wasteland, the door looming before him. The whispers returned, but now they weren't just surrounding him. They were inside him, clawing at his mind. "You don't know what's behind it. You can't escape it." The words were suffocating. Sam felt the weight of them pressing down on him, dragging him closer to the door. The pull was too strong, too irresistible. He reached out again, and this time his hand made contact with the cold surface of the door. The moment his fingers touched the ancient wood, the ground beneath him trembled. The door opened with a creak, and a blinding light spilled out, illuminating the wasteland in an eerie glow. Sam stepped forward, unsure of what he was about to face. "It's not what you think," the whispers warned. "It will never be what you think." But Sam didn't listen. He stepped through the doorway, his mind a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and anticipation. The light enveloped him, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then the world shifted. He was no longer in the wasteland. He was standing in the middle of a crowded room, surrounded by people. But these weren't just any people. They were the ones he had seen before, the faces from the shadows. The twisted, hollow-eyed faces. They were here, standing in front of him, watching him, waiting for him to understand. Sam's breath caught in his throat. He realized with a sickening clarity that this was where the story began. This was where it would end. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in on Sam with every heartbeat. The people around him didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak. They simply stared, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their expressions frozen in time. Sam's breath quickened as the weight of their gaze pressed down on him. He wanted to run, to escape, but his legs refused to move. It was as though the room itself had ensnared him, trapping him in this nightmare of stillness and silence. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt tight as though something invisible was choking him. The faces remained unchanged, their eyes unwavering. "What do you want from me?" Sam finally managed to choke out. His voice sounded foreign to him, distant, as if it wasn't his own. There was no response. The silence stretched on, suffocating, maddening. Sam could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, could hear his own breath, ragged and shallow, but still the people didn't move. They didn't react. The room felt colder now, the air thick with a sense of dread. Sam's gaze shifted around the room, taking in his surroundings for the first time. The walls were lined with old, worn tapestries, their images faded with time. The floor beneath his feet was covered in a threadbare rug, its colors barely visible through the dirt and grime. But what truly caught his attention were the symbols. Everywhere he looked, there they were, etched into the walls, woven into the fabric of the tapestries, carved into the wood of the furniture. The same symbols that had appeared in the notebook. The same symbols that had haunted him since the moment he opened it. The realization hit him like a freight train. He was no longer just trapped in this room. He was inside the story now. Inside the very thing he had tried to escape. The whispers returned, soft at first, then growing louder, their words overlapping in a maddening cacophony. Sam couldn't make sense of them, couldn't focus on any one voice. But he could feel them crawling into his mind, digging deep into his thoughts. "You brought us here," a voice whispered in his ear, its breath cold and rancid. "You open the door. You can't leave." Sam's heart raced. He couldn't leave. Not now. Not ever. The people around him began to move. Slowly at first, their bodies jerking in unnatural movements, their limbs twitching as though they were puppets on strings. And then, in one sudden, horrifying motion, they all turned toward him, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions of hunger and rage. "You belong to us now," they said in unison, their voices merging into a single deafening roar. "You are ours. Forever." Sam stumbled backward, his legs giving out beneath him. He landed hard on the floor, his head spinning. The figures loomed over him, their hands reaching down, cold and skeletal, their fingers curling toward him with a hunger that sent waves of terror through his chest. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The fear paralyzed him, locking him in place, unable to move, unable to escape. The figures were closer now, their faces contorting into horrific masks, their mouths stretching into grotesque, silent screams. Sam's breath caught in his throat as their hands closed in on him, their fingers brushing against his skin. Cold. So cold. And then everything stopped. The room fell silent once again. The figures were still, their hands hovering just inches from his face, but they weren't moving anymore. It was as though time had frozen. Sam dared to blink, to breathe, but when he opened his eyes, everything had changed. The room was gone. The figures were gone. The tapestries, the rug, the symbols, they were all gone. In their place was a vast, empty space. A void. The air felt lighter. But there was no relief. Sam was still trapped, still stuck in this nightmare, but now he was surrounded by nothingness. The emptiness pressed in on him from all sides, crushing him in its suffocating grip. "This is your choice," a voice whispered, echoing from every direction. "You could have left. You could have turned away. But you didn't. You couldn't." Sam's mind spun. What did it mean? What choice was he being given? He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but there were no answers. The void gave him nothing. Just endless silence, broken only by the whispers, the taunting voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You can't leave now," the voice continued. "Not unless you finish it. Not unless you complete the story." The word sent a chill down Sam's spine. Complete the story? How could he? He didn't even know what the story was anymore. He didn't know what was real and what was just part of the nightmare. But one thing was clear. If he didn't finish it, he would never escape. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices overlapping in a maddening chorus. Sam's thoughts became muddled, his mind spinning with the pressure of their demands. He tried to push the voices away, tried to focus, but the weight of them was unbearable. He could feel the darkness closing in, could feel the pull of it tugging at his very soul. "Finish it, Sam," they whispered. "Finish it or you will never be free." Sam's eyes scanned the void around him, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no escape, no way out, not unless he played their game. He had to finish it, he had to write the ending. But even as he thought it, a part of him screamed to stop. What if the end was worse than this? What if there was no escape at all? But the void wouldn't let him rest. The whispers wouldn't let him think. He had to finish the story. "Finish it," they repeated, "or you will be one of us." Sam closed his eyes, his hands trembling as he reached for the notebook. He didn't know what the end would be, but he knew it would be the only way to stop the nightmare. "Write it, Sam." With a shaky breath, he opened the notebook. And as the first words began to form on the page, the room around him trembled once again. The words came slowly at first, reluctant, as if the notebook itself was fighting against him. But as Sam's pen moved across the page, the atmosphere around him began to change. The void seemed to pulse, the darkness breathing, responding to the rhythm of his writing. Each word he wrote felt like a step deeper into the unknown, a deeper descent into the horrors that had haunted him from the very beginning. He could feel it. The weight of the story, the oppressive pull of something ancient and powerful. It was like the words themselves were alive, twisting and turning in his mind as he wrote. He couldn't stop now. He couldn't let it win. He had to finish it. But even as the ink flowed, he began to wonder, was he writing the ending? Or was the ending writing him? The question gnawed at him, sinking deeper with every stroke of the pen. Sam's hand shook, his body drenched in sweat. The air in the void grew colder, the silence around him thickening with every word he wrote. It was as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart, piece by piece, unraveling as he continued. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder than before, echoing through his mind like 1,000 voices trapped in the wind. They weren't just voices anymore, they were images, visions. Fragments of memories he couldn't place, faces he didn't recognize, places he'd never been. It was all too much, too fast. "You're almost there." The voice was clear now, sharp, like a knife cutting through his thoughts. "Finish it, Sam. Only then can you be free." The pressure to write, to finish, was suffocating. Sam's chest tightened with every breath, and his hands were shaking so violently that the pen almost slipped from his grasp. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't let the voices win. "You're close now." The voice again, this time louder, as if standing just behind him. "Closer than you realize." A sudden chill crawled down his spine and he froze. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. No, there was something else. Something physical. Sam slowly turned his head, dreading what he might see. Standing behind him, just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. At first, it was only a shadow, a vague outline in the dark. But as his eyes adjusted, it became clearer. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. A woman, tall and thin, her features sharp and hollow, like a person carved from bone. Her skin was ashen, almost translucent, and her eyes were black. No pupils, no whites, just endless voids. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But Sam could feel her presence, pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. "Who are you?" Sam's voice cracked as he turned fully to face her. His mind raced, but he couldn't remember seeing her before. "What do you want from me?" The woman's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, but it wasn't a kind one. It was a cruel, twisted thing, as if she was mocking him. And then she spoke. "I've been waiting for you, Sam." Her voice was cold, like the wind sweeping through the ruins of a forgotten city. "Waiting for you to finish what you started." Sam's heart skipped a beat. He didn't understand. What was she talking about? What did she mean, waiting for him to finish? She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was savoring the moment. Sam took an instinctive step back, but his feet felt heavy, as if the ground beneath him was dragging him down. "You think you can escape this? You think you can leave?" "There's no leaving, Sam. Not for you. Not for any of us." Her words struck like a slap to his face. No escape? But how? How could this all be happening? What was the truth behind all of this? Why was he stuck in this endless nightmare? "The story isn't just something you can finish," she continued, her voice now almost a whisper. The story is you. And the story will never end. Sam's blood ran cold. He shook his head, his mind reeling. No. I can finish it. I can stop it. But the woman only smiled, that same cold, twisted smile that made Sam's stomach turn. You can try, Sam. You can try. But you won't stop it. You can never stop it. She stepped even closer, her face now inches from his. The air around her was freezing, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Sam's breath turned to mist. This is your fate. And you sealed it the moment you opened the notebook? Sam recoiled, his mind racing. The notebook. The thing that had started it all. It was all connected. The forest, the cabin, the door, the symbols, the whispers, and now this woman, this thing. She was part of it all, part of the story. He realized with a horrible clarity that there was no escaping this. There was no way out. This wasn't just a nightmare. It was his reality, his future, his past. It was everything. The woman reached out a hand, her cold fingers grazing his cheek. Sam froze. It's time to finish it, Sam, she whispered, her breath like ice against his skin. Write the end, or you'll become one of us. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, the weight of them crushing him. He had to write. He had to finish. But he didn't know how. He didn't know what to write anymore. Was this really the end? Or was it just the beginning of something worse? But before he could even begin to think, the woman took a step back. Her face, expressionless now, seemed to fade into the darkness, leaving Sam standing alone once more. He was left with only the notebook, the pen in his hand, and the pressure of a story that was far from finished. Finish it, Sam. The voice echoed around him. Finish it or you will never leave. Never wake up. Sam's hand trembled as he gripped the pen. He knew deep down that writing would be his only chance. But there was one question that lingered, gnawing at him, refusing to let go. What if finishing the story meant losing himself forever? Sam's heart raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of panic and dread. The woman's words echoed in his mind, reverberating through every corner of his consciousness. Finish it or you'll never wake up. His fingers hovered over the page, the pen trembling in his grasp. He didn't know what to write. What could he possibly write? What was the end? Was there even an end? Or had the very act of writing this story tied him to something far worse than he could ever imagine? The room, the void, felt heavier now, as if the very air was thick with the weight of his decision. Every breath he took was labored, every movement slow and deliberate. He felt like he was walking through molasses, unable to escape the suffocating pressure closing in on him. The notebook, with its blank pages staring back at him, seemed to mock him. It was empty, yet it was the source of all his suffering. It had led him here, to this point of no return. Was it truly his choice to finish it? Or had he been led here by something far more sinister, something that knew exactly how he would react? As he gazed at the blank page, a sudden realization hit him. The ending wasn't something he could control. It had already been written. He was merely a puppet, his hand guided by forces beyond his understanding. The whispering voices grew louder in his ears, their words twisting together into a chaotic jumble of incomprehensible sounds. It was as if the very fabric of reality was bending around him, pushing him to write. No, forcing him. Each passing second felt like an eternity, each moment stretched thin under the pressure of what he had to do. A shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. Sam's breath hitched and he snapped his head to the side. There, standing in the corner of the room, was the figure of a man. Tall, with broad shoulders and a face obscured in shadow. His eyes were the only thing visible, piercing, cold, and empty. Sam couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He just stared at the figure, his mind a haze of confusion and fear. You can't escape, Sam. The man's voice was deep, resonating in the silence like the toll of a distant bell. You never could. Sam's throat went dry. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but no sound came. His legs felt weak, as if the very weight of the man's gaze was enough to drain him of all his strength. I've been watching you, the man continued, stepping forward. Every decision you've made, every move you've taken. You think this is about the notebook, but it's not. It's about you. The man's voice was so cold, so final, that Sam could feel his skin crawl. His mind was spinning, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. But it didn't make sense. None of it made sense. What are you? Sam managed to whisper, his voice barely a rasp. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his face still hidden in the shadows. The darkness around him seemed to deepen with each step, pulling the very light from the room until all that remained was a suffocating blackness that pressed in on Sam from all sides. You're part of the story now, Sam, the man said, his voice low and steady. And once you're part of it, there's no going back. Sam's chest tightened, his heart pounding in his ears. What do you want from me? He gasped, struggling to stay upright. The man's face finally emerged from the shadows, revealing features that were eerily familiar. His eyes, those cold, empty eyes, were the same eyes Sam had seen in the notebook, in the symbols, in the faces of the people who had haunted him. The same eyes that now stared at him with a haunting, unblinking intensity. I want you to finish the story, the man said, his lips curling into a sinister smile. You can't escape what's already been written. You never could. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Sam's mind reeled. How could he have been so blind? He had thought he was in control, that by writing, by finishing the story, he could end it all. But now he realized he wasn't the one writing. He had never been. The figure reached out, his hand cold and unyielding, and placed it on Sam's shoulder. Sam froze, the contact sending a shockwave through his body. He wanted to pull away, but he couldn't. The man's grip was ironclad. You were chosen, Sam, the man whispered. Chosen to write. Chosen to bring it to its end. But in doing so, you become part of the story. And once you're in it, there's no way out. The weight of his words settled in Sam's chest like a lead anchor. The very air around him seemed to thicken, the darkness pressing in on him like a physical force. Sam's breath came in shallow gasps, his thoughts scrambled. The story wasn't just a story. It was a trap that he had walked right into. But I didn't ask for this, Sam protested weakly. I didn't want any of this. The man chuckled darkly, a sound that made Sam's skin crawl. It doesn't matter what you want, he said. It only matters what's been written. And you, Sam, are a part of that now. You can't change it. The man stepped back, his hand sliding off Sam's shoulder as he melted into the shadows. Sam's pulse hammered in his ears, his head spinning. Was this really happening? Was he truly trapped? The end is coming, Sam, the man's voice echoed from the darkness, his words lingering in the heavy silence. You can finish it, or it will finish you. Sam turned back to the notebook, the pen still in his hand, but now the weight of it felt unbearable. The last word had to be written. The end had to be formed. But as he stared at the blank page, the question burned in his mind. If he wrote the end, would it truly be over? Or was finishing the story just the beginning of something far worse? The room was colder now. The silence felt thicker, more suffocating than ever before. Sam's hand hovered above the notebook, his fingers frozen, the pen trembling in his grasp. His mind was racing, thoughts clashing, colliding, fighting for dominance, but one question remained at the forefront of his mind. What happens if I finish it? The weight of the question was crushing, and yet the pressure to write it out was inescapable. The words felt like they were clawing their way out of his chest, pulling at him, begging him to let them spill onto the page. But Sam wasn't ready. Not yet. He couldn't shake the image of the man with the empty eyes, the figure who had appeared in the shadows. Every word he spoke resonated in Sam's mind, and now they seemed to repeat in a constant loop, like a haunting refrain that wouldn't let him rest. You can't escape. You never could. He stared at the notebook, the blank page mocking him. It was as if it was waiting patiently for him to make a decision that would shape his fate. But what was the right choice? Could he really finish it? Could he trust the story to give him peace? Or was finishing it simply another way of sealing his doom? A sudden thought struck him. He didn't want to be part of the story anymore. He didn't want to play the game. He just wanted out. But the truth gnawed at him, a bitter pill he couldn't swallow. There was no way out. Not now. Not ever. The chilling thought hit him like a wave, and his breath caught in his throat. What if the man had been right? What if he had been chosen, like a pawn in a game he couldn't understand? He shuddered at the thought. Could he really change the course of this twisted fate? Was there any hope left, or was he doomed to follow this path to the end? Suddenly he felt it. A cold draft brushed against his skin, and a faint whisper danced in the air, like a distant voice calling his name. Sam? The voice was soft, like a sigh, but it carried with it a weight that pressed down on him, forcing his mind to focus. Sam's head snapped to the side. There, in the corner of the room, standing just beyond the edge of the light, was the woman. The same woman he had seen before, the one with the hollow, empty eyes. She was staring at him, silent, as if waiting for him to make his next move. Her presence sent a cold shiver down his spine, but Sam couldn't look away. Something about her was different this time. She was no longer just an observer. She was a part of this, part of him, part of the story. You've been avoiding it. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sliced through the silence like a blade. You think you can hide from the truth, Sam? You can't. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His throat was dry, his voice lost in the storm of thoughts swirling inside his mind. The woman stepped closer, the shadows seemingly moving with her, as if they were drawn to her presence. You're afraid, she continued, her voice softer now, but still carrying that haunting, irresistible power. Afraid of what will happen if you finish it. Afraid of what you'll become. But you're already becoming it, Sam. The woman's eyes locked onto his, and Sam felt a shiver creep up his spine. Her gaze was cold, but it wasn't just coldness that chilled him. It was the emptiness behind those eyes, the void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. There's no escape, Sam, she said, her words cutting through him like ice. You've always known that deep down. The story isn't just something you write. It's something you live. You're trapped in it. And now there's no way out. Her words felt like a slow poison, seeping into his thoughts, twisting them. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the choice he had to make. Could he truly finish it? Could he face the end and not lose himself in the process? I don't want this, Sam whispered, the words slipping from his mouth before he could stop them. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cruel, mocking. You never did. But it doesn't matter. You're already part of it. There's no turning back. The room grew darker, the shadows creeping closer, wrapping around him like a tightening noose. Sam's breath became shallow, his pulse quickening. The notebook on the table seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the pages fluttering as if urging him to continue, to finish it. The woman reached out, her cold fingers brushing against his cheek. Sam recoiled at the touch, but he couldn't move. Her presence was suffocating, all-encompassing. You have to finish it, Sam, she whispered, her voice like a dark lullaby. You have to finish the story or it will finish you. Her words echoed in his mind, the threat hanging in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Sam's hand shook as he reached for the notebook, his fingers trembling as he opened it to the next blank page. The words he had been avoiding for so long now stared back at him, demanding to be written. He couldn't do it. He couldn't write the end. Not yet. He needed more time, more answers. But as his hand hovered above the page, the whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of unseen forces urging him on. Finish it, Sam. Finish it now. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a command. Sam gripped the pen tighter, his heart racing in his chest. He could feel the darkness closing in, the weight of the woman's gaze pressing down on him. There was no escape. There never had been. You're part of it now, she repeated, her voice low and final. And when it's done, you'll be one of us. With trembling hands, Sam began to write. The pen moved of its own accord. Sam could feel the pull, the force that guided his hand as though someone, was writing through him. The words spilled onto the page like they had been waiting, like they had always been there, and he was merely the vessel. His hand trembled, but it didn't matter. The words weren't his anymore. They never had been. Finish it, the whisper from behind him urged again. Sam could feel the woman's cold breath on the back of his neck, like a shadow trailing his every movement. You can't stop now. You never could. He tried to pull away, tried to stop, but his fingers refused. The pen pressed down harder, the ink flowing faster than he could comprehend, as if the story itself was desperate to break free from the confines of the page. Sam's vision blurred, the edges of the room becoming distorted, as though reality itself was warping around him. The shadows seemed to stretch, crawl, and twist with a life of their own, closing in on him. He didn't want to finish it. He didn't want to become part of this cursed tale. But the story was taking shape, pulling him deeper into its grip with every word, every line. The darkness was all around him now, swallowing the light, devouring everything. The woman's voice grew louder. It's almost over, Sam. You can feel it, can't you? The end is near. The words on the page shifted. Sam could barely make sense of them, fragments of sentences, pieces of something he couldn't understand. They were foreign to him, yet somehow familiar, like echoes of his own thoughts, twisted and warped into something monstrous. A loud thud echoed through the room. Sam's head snapped up, his pulse racing, eyes searching the shadows. Had he imagined it? Or was something, or someone, moving in the dark? The silence stretched. The oppressive stillness seemed to crush him, tightening around him like a vice. And then a soft voice, barely a whisper, echoed through the room. Sam? The voice was faint, but it sent a jolt of terror through his body. He knew that voice. He had heard it before. It was his own voice, but it wasn't. It sounded wrong, distorted, twisted. And it wasn't coming from his mouth. Sam turned around quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. There, in the corner, was the same figure, the man with the empty eyes. He was standing still, unmoving, but somehow his presence felt like a storm waiting to break. The shadows around him seemed to shift and move, as if alive, as if the very air itself was bending around him. "You're closer than you think, Sam," the man's voice rumbled, low and dangerous. "The end is just a page away." Sam's hand clenched around the pen, his knuckles white with the strain. His heart raced in his chest, the rhythmic pounding filling his ears. He had to stop this. He had to fight back, but he couldn't. The words had already begun. The story had already started to write itself. "You can't fight it," the man said, his voice steady and sure. "You never could." The figure stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with cold emptiness. Sam's legs trembled, threatening to give way beneath him. He had no idea what was real anymore. Was this still the world he knew? Or had it all become part of the story, one that he could never escape? "You think you're in control, Sam," the man continued, his eyes narrowing. "But the truth is you never were. The moment you picked up the pen, you became part of the narrative. And now there's no turning back." Sam tried to move, tried to get up from the chair, but his body felt frozen. His fingers couldn't stop gripping the pen. His mind screamed at him to let go, to break free, but he couldn't. He was trapped. The man was right. The end was near, and there was nothing he could do to change it. The shadows around him seemed to grow thicker, darker. They pressed in on him, wrapping around his limbs like chains, pulling him back toward the desk. The pen, no longer an object of his will, moved in his hand, guiding his fingers as it danced across the page. "Write it," the man's voice boomed, filling the room. "Write the end, Sam. It's time." His words came faster now. They flowed as if they were being ripped from his mind, splashed onto the paper in chaotic, jagged lines. His heart raced, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, suffocating him with each passing second. But there was something else, something darker. As the words formed, Sam began to understand. The story wasn't just an end, it was a beginning. A beginning for something far worse than he could have imagined. A beginning for him. The story was taking shape, but not in the way he expected. The pages of the notebook weren't just filled with words. They were filled with his soul. "Finish it," the woman's voice urged again, as if she knew what was happening, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Sam's vision blurred, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he was still in the room. Was he in the story now? Was the story in him? Everything felt like it was spiraling out of control, the walls closing in, the shadows wrapping tighter and tighter around his body. He had to finish it. He didn't know why, but he did. The story needed its ending. He needed it. Or perhaps the story needed him to finish it. The words flowed from his hand, faster now, more urgent. They filled the page. And as they did, something else filled the air. A presence. A dark, overwhelming force, waiting just beyond the shadows. Sam's breath caught in his throat as he wrote the final word. The last sentence, the last thought, left his mind and passed into the notebook. And then everything went still. The darkness around him was gone. The voices stopped. But Sam didn't feel relief. No, he felt something else. The weight of it. The knowledge that he had finished it, that the story was complete. The ending wasn't just a conclusion. It was an awakening. And Sam was the one who had brought it into being. And now it was too late. The silence stretched on, suffocating, heavy. Sam sat there, still, his hand still gripping the pen, his mind reeling. The words he had written weren't just words. They were a sentence, a verdict, a release. He could feel the story unfolding in the very air around him, like a force he couldn't see but could feel, pressing in from every direction. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The room around him had become different. It was no longer just his room, no longer just the place where he had sat for hours, fighting with the notebook. It was something else now, something darker. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows crawling along the floor like living things, each one a reminder of what he had just unleashed. Sam's mind raced. He had finished it. He had written the end. But in doing so, had he trapped himself? Had he condemned himself to this world? Or was he simply the first of many? The first to fall into the story? He heard it again. A whisper so soft it was almost imperceptible. But this time he didn't need to ask who it was. He knew. "You're part of it now," the woman's voice echoed, distant, but as clear as if she were standing beside him. Sam's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. He turned to face her, but she was not there, not physically. She was somewhere between the shadows, between the cracks in reality, her presence more felt than seen. "You finished it," she continued, her voice growing louder, more tangible. And now you'll never leave. Her words wrapped around him, coiling in his chest like a vice. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to accept it. But deep down he knew. This was the price. This was the cost of finishing the story. The notebook lay in front of him, its pages now full, its final sentence written in ink that felt like it had been burned into the paper. Sam reached out to touch it, but as his fingers brushed the pages, the ink shifted, the words rearranging themselves, almost as if they were alive, breathing, changing. He recoiled, his heart pounding harder. He couldn't stop it. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he wanted to tear the pages apart, the story had already consumed him. The shadows in the room moved closer. They crept along the floor, climbing up the walls as if they were drawn to the book, drawn to the end Sam had written. He could hear them now, soft whispers, murmurs, as though the very air was thick with the voices of those who had come before him. The ones who had finished their own stories. The ones who had written the ending, only to find that the ending was just another beginning. Sam's hand trembled, his fingers moving of their own accord, reaching for the book again. He wanted to close it. He wanted to shut it, to forget it all, but as soon as he touched it, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. You can't escape it, the voices hissed. You're part of it now. You'll never be free. The woman's cold laugh echoed through the room, her presence more palpable now than ever before. Sam could feel her, just beyond his sight, waiting. Watching. There's no turning back, Sam, she said, her voice like ice. You wanted the end, but there was never an end. Only the story. And the story never ends. Sam stood, his legs shaking beneath him. He had to get out. He had to leave this place. But the room seemed to stretch, the walls bending, twisting, closing in around him. It was as if the very space itself was being consumed by the story, by the thing that had been written. The boundaries of reality were fading, erasing themselves with each passing second. The woman's form began to materialize in the corner of the room, her features coming into focus, her face more twisted than before. You thought you could escape, she said, her eyes glinting with dark amusement. But you're not the first. And you won't be the last. Sam's breath came in shallow gasps. His mind was a storm of confusion and fear. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. The room was no longer just a place. It was alive, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into its depths. The woman took a step forward, and the shadows followed her, closing in around Sam. He could feel them, crawling under his skin, pressing in on him. They were inside him now. The story had become part of him, and he had become part of it. The air grew colder, the darkness heavier. Sam's eyes darted around the room, but there was no escape. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they were all closing in, becoming one with the pages, one with the ink, one with the story. It's done, the woman whispered, a satisfied grin spreading across her face. And you'll never leave. You'll never be free. Sam's mind snapped. He couldn't fight it anymore. He was part of it, and there was no going back. As the darkness fully consumed him, the last thing Sam heard was the woman's voice, echoing in his mind over and over. The story never ends. Story 2. The first knock was soft, barely audible over the creaking trees outside. Sam dismissed it, telling himself it was just the wind. He hated being alone at night. The silence of the house seemed to amplify every sound, turning harmless creaks and groans into something sinister. But the second knock was louder, deliberate. It wasn't the wind. Sam's chest tightened as he glanced at the clock. 11:48 p.m. His neighborhood was quiet, a sleepy cul-de-sac where nothing ever happened. No one should have been at the door this late. He stayed frozen on the couch, hoping whoever, or whatever it was would go away. But then came the third knock. It was slow, rhythmic, with an unnatural precision that sent shivers down his spine. Sam stood reluctantly, his bare feet brushing against the cold floor as he moved toward the door. Peering through the peephole, his breath caught. There was no one there. Just the empty porch bathed in the dim, flickering glow of the streetlight. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a shadow darting across the edge of his vision, but when he blinked, it was gone. He should have turned away. Any sensible person would have locked the door and gone back to pretending they hadn't heard a thing. But Sam wasn't sensible that night. Something, a strange pull he couldn't explain, compelled him to open the door. The hinges creaked as the door swung open. The chill of the night air wrapped around him, and for a second he thought he was imagining it. The box. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, but its presence was heavy, as though the air around it had thickened. Intricate symbols, etched deep into its surface, shimmered faintly under the streetlight. Sam stared at it, his skin crawling. There was no note, no sign of who might have left it. It didn't belong there, but it seemed intentional, like it was meant for him. "Who's there?" Sam called into the night, his voice shaking. Silence. The darkness seemed to press in closer, suffocating. Sam hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to shut the door. But against his better judgment, he reached down and picked up the box. It was cold, unnaturally so, and heavier than it looked. As he carried it inside, he noticed a faint vibration, almost like a heartbeat pulsing through the wood. He placed it on the kitchen table, standing over it like it might explode. He didn't want to open it. He told himself he wouldn't. But as the minutes ticked by, the box seemed to hum louder, the symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. And then he saw it. The key. It hadn't been there before. It was just there, lying next to the box as if it had materialized out of thin air. Sam's stomach churned. He picked it up with trembling hands, the cold metal sending a jolt through his fingers. The key was old, its surface worn and rusted, but the symbols carved into it were identical to those on the box. Sam stared at it, his breath shallow, his mind racing. He didn't know what was in the box, and he wasn't sure he wanted to find out. But the pull was irresistible. His hands moved on their own, fitting the key into the lock. The click echoed through the room, louder than it should have been, and for a moment, everything was still. The box seemed to vibrate under his touch, its hum growing deeper, more insistent. Sam's heart pounded as he lifted the lid. At first there was nothing. Just darkness, a void so deep it seemed to swallow the light around it. He leaned closer, his curiosity warring with his fear. And then he saw it. A movement. Subtle but undeniable. He froze, his breath catching in his throat as a pale, skeletal hand reached out from the darkness. It gripped the edge of the box, its fingers impossibly long, its nails jagged and cracked. Sam stumbled backward, his chair screeching against the floor. The hand was followed by an arm, then a head, its face gaunt, its eyes black hollows that seemed to draw him in. The creature climbed out of the box with a fluidity that didn't seem possible, its body impossibly thin, its joints bending at unnatural angles. It stared at Sam, its hollow eyes boring into his soul. "Thank you," it rasped, its voice dry and cracked. Sam's knees buckled as he tried to back away, but the creature didn't move toward him. It turned instead, looking at the box, which now glowed with an eerie, pulsating light. "You shouldn't have opened it," the creature said, almost amused. Sam's mouth went dry. What are you?" The creature smiled, its lips pulling back to reveal jagged, yellowed teeth. "A messenger." "For what?" Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature tilted its head, its smile widening. "You'll see." And then it was gone. The box went dark, the symbols fading into nothingness. The key was still in Sam's hand, its surface warm now, almost burning. He stared at it, his mind racing. And then the whispers began. Faint at first, barely discernible. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of unintelligible words. Sam clutched his head, the sound unbearable. "Stop," he screamed. And just like that, the whispers ceased. The house fell silent, but the air was thick with a sense of dread. Sam looked down at the key, its symbols glowing faintly. He knew it wasn't over. The whispers didn't stop, not completely. Even as the silence returned to the house, they lingered, faint but persistent, like a faint echo in the back of Sam's mind. He tried to ignore them, pacing the kitchen with the key still clutched tightly in his hand. But the weight of it was unbearable, as if it wasn't just metal but something far more sinister. He dropped the key onto the table, and the moment it hit the surface, it seemed to hum again, vibrating ever so slightly. Sam stared at it, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. "What do you want?" he muttered, his voice shaking. No answer. But the symbols on the key pulsed faintly, their glow almost hypnotic. Sam turned away, determined not to look at it. He needed to think, to figure out what was happening. But as he turned to leave the kitchen, something stopped him in his tracks. Footsteps. They weren't his. They were soft, deliberate, coming from somewhere upstairs. Sam froze, his blood running cold. He lived alone. The footsteps grew louder, moving down the hallway above him. Sam's eyes darted to the ceiling, his breath caught in his throat. The air grew colder, and for a moment he swore he saw his own breath fogging up in the dim light. He grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a kitchen knife, and slowly made his way toward the staircase. His legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last as he climbed the stairs. The hallway stretched out before him, dark and uninviting. At the far end, the door to his bedroom was ajar, a sliver of pale light spilling out into the hallway. Sam's grip on the knife tightened as he approached, his heart pounding so loudly it was all he could hear. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely more than a whisper. The door creaked open further in response, as if inviting him inside. Sam swallowed hard, his hand trembling as he pushed the door open. The room was empty. His bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. But something felt wrong. The air was heavy, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle. And then he saw it. The box. It was sitting on his bedside table, its dark surface gleaming faintly in the light. But Sam knew he'd left it downstairs. He was sure of it. "What the hell is going on?" he whispered, his voice cracking. As if in response, the box began to hum again, louder this time. The symbols etched into its surface glowed brightly, casting eerie patterns onto the walls. Sam backed away, his pulse racing. And then the whispers returned. They were louder now, more distinct. Sam could almost make out words, though they didn't make any sense. His head throbbed as the voices overlapped, growing more frantic. "Stop it," he shouted, clutching his head. The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural laugh. It wasn't coming from the box. It was coming from behind him. Sam spun around, his knife raised, but there was nothing there. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the room, until it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. "Who's there?" Sam demanded, his voice trembling. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive. Sam's gaze darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement. And then he saw it, a shadow darker than the rest, slinking along the wall. It moved unnaturally, shifting and twisting as it approached him. Sam stumbled backward, his back hitting the edge of the bed. The shadow stopped, coalescing into a shape, a figure that was tall, impossibly thin, its features indistinct. "You shouldn't have opened it," the figure said, its voice a distorted echo. Sam's grip on the knife tightened, though he knew it was useless. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out a hand, long and clawed, pointing toward the box. "Return what you've taken," it said. Sam shook his head, his mind racing. I don't know what you mean." The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. Sam could feel its coldness, its malice, seeping into his skin. "You've taken something that doesn't belong to you," it hissed. "And now you will pay the price." Before Sam could react, the figure lunged toward him. He swung the knife wildly, but it passed through the figure as if it were smoke. The shadow enveloped him, and suddenly Sam was falling into darkness, into nothingness. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in his bedroom. He was standing in a vast, empty space, the ground beneath him made of cold, black stone. The air was thick with a strange, metallic smell, and in the distance he could see faint, flickering lights. The box was there, sitting in the center of the stone floor, its glow pulsing rhythmically. The key was lying next to it as if waiting for him. "You've entered their domain," a voice echoed, deep and resonant. Sam turned, but there was no one there. "Who are they?" Sam asked, his voice trembling. "They are the keepers," the voice replied. "And you've broken the seal." "What seal?" Sam demanded. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the ground beneath him began to tremble, cracks spidering out from where the box sat. Sam stumbled, his heart pounding as the cracks spread, glowing with an ominous red light. The box began to open, its lid lifting slowly. Sam wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as the darkness inside the box spilled out, consuming everything in its path. And then he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the sound of countless voices, screaming in unison, their agony filling the air. The last thing Sam saw before the darkness consumed him was the key, glowing brightly in the void. When Sam woke, his chest felt heavy, as if he were buried under a mountain of dread. His surroundings were unrecognizable, a barren, endless wasteland bathed in a sickly, grayish hue. The sky above churned with dark clouds, their movements unnatural and hypnotic. A faint hum filled the air, vibrating deep within his bones, as though the world itself was alive and watching him. The box was gone. The key, however, was still in his hand, its symbols now glowing faintly, almost mockingly. Sam's breathing was shallow as he stumbled to his feet, his mind racing. "Where am I?" he muttered to no one in particular. The ground beneath him was cold and cracked, each fissure pulsating with a dim red light, as if something was alive just beneath the surface. He could feel it, the presence of something vast and ancient, something far beyond his comprehension. Then came the voice. "You're where you belong." Sam spun around, his heart pounding. A figure stood in the distance, shrouded in shadow. Its outline was blurry, shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. "Who are you?" Sam demanded, his voice cracking. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth, as though it were gliding rather than walking. As it approached, Sam could see its face, or rather, the lack of one. Its features were obscured, its form constantly shifting, as if it were a reflection in disturbed water. "You broke the seal," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, echoing unnaturally. "And now you must face the consequences." "I didn't mean to," Sam shouted. "I don't even know what this is." The figure tilted its head, its featureless face almost mocking. "Ignorance does not absolve you. The box was never meant to be opened. The key was never meant to be used." Sam clutched the key tightly, its warmth searing into his palm. "Then why leave it for me? Why bring me here?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised an arm, its elongated fingers pointing toward the horizon. Sam followed its gaze, his stomach dropping. In the distance, shapes moved. They were too far to make out clearly, but their forms were grotesque, writhing and contorting as they crawled across the landscape. A low, guttural growl filled the air, sending chills down Sam's spine. "They're coming," the figure said simply. "For me?" Sam whispered, his throat dry. The figure didn't respond. It began to fade, its form dissolving into the air. "You must run," it said before disappearing completely. Sam didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, his legs carrying him across the cracked ground as fast as they could. The shapes in the distance grew closer, their movements erratic and horrifying. The growls turned into roars, each one vibrating through Sam's chest. He risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately regretted it. The creatures were monstrous, their bodies a grotesque amalgamation of limbs, eyes, and mouths. They moved with unnatural speed, their malformed bodies defying the laws of physics as they closed the distance. Sam's lungs burned as he ran, his legs threatening to give out. The landscape offered no shelter, no place to hide. He was utterly exposed, a lone figure in an endless wasteland. And then he saw it. In the distance, a structure loomed, a towering, jagged spire that seemed to pierce the sky itself. It pulsed with a faint, eerie light, drawing Sam toward it like a moth to a flame. He didn't know what it was, but it was his only chance. The creatures were gaining on him, their guttural screams growing louder. Sam pushed himself harder, his body screaming in protest. As he neared the spire, he saw an opening, a dark, gaping entrance that seemed to swallow all light. He didn't hesitate. He dove inside, the darkness enveloping him like a shroud. The air inside was cold, damp, and heavy with the smell of decay. Sam's breaths came in ragged gasps as he pressed himself against the wall, clutching the key like a lifeline. The creatures didn't follow him in. Their screams faded into the distance, replaced by an oppressive silence. Sam's relief was short-lived. The interior of the spire was vast, far larger than it had seemed from the outside. The walls were covered in the same symbols that adorned the box and the key, glowing faintly in the dim light. The floor was made of the same cracked stone, its fissures pulsing with a red light that seemed to pulse in time with Sam's heartbeat. And then he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from deeper within the spire, echoing through the dark corridors. Sam hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to stay where he was. But the whisper grew louder, more insistent, tugging at something deep within him. He didn't want to follow it, but his legs moved on their own, carrying him deeper into the darkness. The corridor twisted and turned, its walls narrowing until Sam had to squeeze through in places. The whispers grew louder, their words still unintelligible but filled with a sense of urgency. And then he saw it. The chamber. It was massive, its walls covered in the same glowing symbols. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat another box. This one was larger, its surface even more intricately carved. The key in Sam's hand grew hot, its glow intensifying. "No," Sam whispered, shaking his head. "I'm not opening it." But the whispers wouldn't stop. They filled the chamber, growing louder and louder until Sam thought his head would split. The key seemed to pull him forward, dragging him toward the pedestal. He tried to resist, but it was futile. His hands moved on their own, fitting the key into the lock. The moment it clicked, the whisper stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, Sam thought nothing would happen. But then the box began to open, its lid lifting slowly. What emerged was worse than anything Sam could have imagined. The lid of the box lifted with an agonizing slowness, every fraction of an inch feeling like a countdown to something inevitable. Sam's breath hitched, his fingers trembling as he stumbled back from the pedestal. The air grew thick and suffocating, carrying a sharp metallic tang that burned his nostrils. A faint, sickly light emanated from the box's interior, casting shifting, unnatural shadows across the walls of the chamber. Then something moved. At first, it was subtle, a ripple of darkness like ink dissolving in water. But it grew, expanding and taking form, an amorphous entity that slithered out of the box with a grace that defied its grotesque shape. Tendrils of blackness stretched and coiled, their edges shimmering with an oily sheen. And then came the sound. It wasn't a growl nor a scream. It was a vibration, low and guttural, resonating deep within Sam's chest. It felt like the sound itself was alive, probing, searching for a way inside him. Sam stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body refused to obey. The entity loomed above him, its shifting form towering and unnatural. Where its face should have been, there was only an abyss, a void that seemed to pull at the very fabric of reality around it. "You," the entity whispered, its voice a cacophony of tones, male and female, young and old. "You brought me back." "I didn't mean to," Sam stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't know." The entity laughed, a sound that was both chilling and sorrowful. "Ignorance does not absolve you. You are the key. You always were." Sam shook his head, his back pressing against the cold stone wall. "I don't understand." "Why me? What is this?" The entity's tendrils writhed, stretching toward him. Sam flinched, expecting pain, but instead he felt a strange warmth, almost comforting. The tendrils didn't harm him. They merely hovered, tracing the air around him. "You hold the connection," it said. "Between the worlds, between what is and what must not be." The chamber seemed to darken further, the symbols on the walls pulsing erratically. Sam's heart raced as he tried to make sense of the entity's words. "I don't want any of this," he said, his voice shaking. "I just want to go home." The entity tilted its head, or what Sam assumed was its head. "There is no going back. The seal is broken, the balance undone. The only path forward is through." Before Sam could respond, the chamber began to shake violently. The ground beneath him cracked, glowing with that same ominous red light. The box on the pedestal shattered, its pieces dissolving into nothingness. From the cracks in the floor, more shapes began to emerge. They were smaller than the entity but no less horrifying, twisted, writhing forms that seemed to defy logic. Their eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a malevolent light, locking onto Sam with predatory intent. "You must choose," the entity said, its voice calm despite the chaos around them. "Choose what?" Sam shouted, his panic rising. "To fight, or to surrender?" The smaller creatures began to close in, their guttural growls filling the air. Sam gripped the key tightly, its glow pulsating in his hand. He felt a strange energy coursing through him, a connection to something far greater than himself. "I don't even know how to fight," he yelled. The entity's tendrils wrapped around him, not in attack but in what felt almost like guidance. "The key is not just a tool. It is a weapon. Use it or be consumed." Sam looked down at the key, its symbols glowing brighter than ever. He didn't know what to do, but the creatures were nearly upon him, their jagged limbs reaching out hungrily. Instinct took over. Sam thrust the key forward, and a blinding light erupted from it. The creatures recoiled, their shrieks piercing the air as the light consumed them. The energy from the key surged through Sam, filling him with a strength he didn't know he possessed. The entity watched silently as Sam fought, the light from the key tearing through the creatures one by one. But the battle was far from over. For every creature he destroyed, more seemed to emerge from the cracks, their numbers endless. "This is futile?" Sam shouted, the exhaustion evident in his voice. The entity moved closer, its form shifting and pulsing. You cannot win through force alone. The key responds to your will, to your intent. Focus. Sam tried to steady his breathing, the key trembling in his hand. He closed his eyes, blocking out the chaos around him. Instead of fighting the creatures, he imagined the cracks sealing, the darkness retreating. The key responded. A wave of energy burst forth, rippling across the chamber. The cracks began to close, the red light fading as the creatures dissolved into nothingness. The ground stilled, the oppressive air lifting. When Sam opened his eyes, the chamber was silent. The entity loomed before him, its form smaller now, less imposing. "You are stronger than I expected," it said. Sam didn't feel strong. His legs threatened to give out, his body shaking with exhaustion. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The entity laughed softly, a sound that sent chills down his spine. "This was merely the beginning. The key has awakened, and so have they. You have only scratched the surface of what lies ahead." "What lies ahead?" Sam asked, dread creeping into his voice. The entity didn't answer. Instead, it began to dissolve, its form fading into the air. "Follow the light," it said before disappearing completely. The key in Sam's hand pulsed once more, brighter than ever. A beam of light shot out from it, illuminating a hidden passage at the far end of the chamber. Sam stared at the passage, his heart sinking. He didn't want to go, but he knew he had no choice. Whatever lay ahead, he had to face it. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, the key lighting his way. The hidden passage stretched before Sam like an unending throat of darkness, its walls seemingly alive, shifting and writhing as though they were made of living shadows. The air grew colder with each step, the light from the key his only companion. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of his own breathing and the occasional distant rumble that sent shivers down his spine. But it wasn't just the darkness or the cold that unnerved him. It was the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking his every move. The passage began to widen, revealing a cavernous hall that seemed far too vast to exist beneath the surface. The floor was uneven, jagged stones jutting out like the broken teeth of some enormous beast. Towering spires of obsidian shot up from the ground, their surfaces etched with symbols that glowed faintly, casting an eerie light across the space. In the center of the hall stood a massive archway, its edges carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when Sam looked directly at them. Beyond the archway was a swirling void, a churning mass of shadow and light that pulsed with a malevolent energy. Sam hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But the key in his hand grew warmer, urging him forward. "This is madness," he muttered to himself, but his legs moved anyway, carrying him toward the archway. As he approached, the void within the archway began to ripple, and a voice echoed through the hall, a voice unlike any he had heard before. It was neither male nor female, young nor old, but a blend of all these things, layered and distorted. "Step through and claim your truth." Sam stopped in his tracks, his grip tightening on the key. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the cavern. The voice laughed, a sound that sent chills racing down his spine. "You already know the answer. You've always known." The key pulsed again, and for a brief moment, the void within the archway cleared. Sam saw flashes of images, his childhood home, the face of a woman he didn't recognize, and a sprawling city bathed in a crimson light. The vision ended as abruptly as it began, leaving Sam gasping for breath. What is this?" he whispered. "It is your path," the voice said. "But you must choose to take it." Sam's heart pounded as he stared at the archway. The swirling void called to him, its pull almost hypnotic. But every fiber of his being screamed that stepping through would change him forever, that there would be no coming back. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice trembling. "No one asks," the voice replied, cold and unyielding. "The key chose you. And now you must decide." Sam took a shaky step forward, then another, until he stood just inches from the archway. The void seemed to reach out to him, its edges writhing like tendrils eager to pull him in. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the symbols on the archway flared to life, their light blinding. The key in Sam's hand grew so hot he thought it might burn him, but he couldn't let go. And then, with a deep breath, he stepped through. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, like being submerged in freezing water and searing flames at the same time. Sam's vision blurred, his ears filled with a deafening roar. His body felt weightless, as though he were falling through an endless void. When the sensation finally stopped, Sam found himself standing in a place that defied explanation. The sky above was an ever-shifting canvas of colors, its hues unnatural and impossible to describe. The ground beneath his feet was smooth and reflective like glass, yet it rippled like water with each step he took. Towers of black stone rose around him, their surfaces alive with symbols that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. And in the distance he saw it, a throne. It was enormous, carved from the same black stone as the towers, its edges jagged and menacing. On the throne sat a figure cloaked in shadow, its form indistinct but undeniably powerful. The air around it seemed to bend and warp, as though reality itself struggled to contain its presence. The figure spoke, its voice echoing in Sam's mind rather than his ears. "You've come far, mortal. But your journey is far from over." Sam's legs trembled as he approached the throne, the key in his hand glowing brighter with each step. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice shaking. The figure leaned forward, its shadowy form shifting. "I am the guardian of what lies beyond, the keeper of the door you've opened." "I didn't mean to open anything," Sam said, his frustration and fear boiling over. "I don't even know what's happening." The figure chuckled, a sound that resonated deep within Sam's chest. "Ignorance is no shield. You hold the key, and with it, you bear the burden of what comes next." "What comes next?" Sam asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, and the ground beneath Sam's feet began to tremble. Cracks appeared, glowing with the same red light he had seen before. The air grew heavy, filled with the scent of ash and decay. "Prove yourself," the figure said, its tone commanding. Before Sam could respond, the ground gave way, and he plummeted into darkness. Sam fell through the void, the air around him silent and suffocating. It wasn't a physical fall. There was no wind rushing past, no sense of acceleration, but the disorienting weightlessness gripped him, making him feel as if he were tumbling endlessly. Then, with a jolt, he landed. The ground beneath him was damp and cold, the texture rough against his hands. He pushed himself up, gasping for breath, his heart racing. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized he was in a forest, but not like any forest he'd ever seen. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their bark blackened and cracked as though scorched by fire. Their branches reached upward like skeletal hands clawing at the sky, which was a swirling mass of deep gray clouds. The air was heavy with an earthy, metallic tang, and faint whispers echoed around him, too soft to discern but impossible to ignore. The key in his hand pulsed faintly, its glow weaker now, as if the energy within it had been drained. Sam stood, his legs unsteady, and surveyed his surroundings. "Where am I?" he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single voice, soft, almost gentle, but laced with an unsettling edge. "You are in the in-between, where choices are weighed and fates are forged." Sam spun around, his eyes darting through the shadows. "Who said that?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the forest seemed to shift around him, the trees creaking and groaning as though alive. The path before him, if it could be called a path, narrowed, flanked by trees that seemed to lean closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a dark tunnel. The key pulsed again, slightly brighter this time, pointing him toward the tunnel. "Of course," Sam said under his breath, sarcasm barely masking his fear. "Why wouldn't it be the creepy tunnel?" He stepped forward cautiously, each crunch of his boots against the damp ground echoing unnaturally loud. The whispers followed him, growing louder with each step. They weren't words, not exactly, but fragments, snatches of sentences that made no sense. "It was always you. The door can't be closed. They're waiting." Sam tried to block them out, focusing on the faint glow of the key. The tunnel grew darker, the light from the key barely illuminating the ground before him. And then, just as he thought he couldn't take another step, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. Sam froze, his grip tightening on the key. Something was watching him. He could feel it, a presence, heavy and suffocating like a predator stalking its prey. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice echoing in the oppressive darkness. For a moment there was nothing. Then from the shadows a figure emerged. It was human, or at least it looked human at first glance. But as it stepped closer, Sam realized something was wrong. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, as though its joints didn't bend the way they should. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were empty voids reflecting no light. What are you? Sam asked, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, its neck cracking audibly. When it spoke, its voice was a distorted mimicry of Sam's own. I am the question you refuse to answer. The fear you will not face. Sam took a step back, his heart pounding. Stay away from me. The figure moved closer, its steps eerily silent. You cannot run. You cannot hide. This is your trial and you must face it. The key in Sam's hand grew warm, its glow intensifying. Without thinking, he raised it, the light bursting forth and illuminating the figure. It recoiled, hissing like a wild animal, its form flickering as though it were struggling to maintain its shape. But then the light dimmed. The key's energy faltered, leaving Sam vulnerable. You are not ready, the figure said, its voice now a chorus of overlapping tones. But they are coming and you must decide. Decide what? Sam shouted, his frustration and fear boiling over. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to dissolve into the shadows, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind. But as it faded, it whispered one final word, run. The forest erupted in chaos. The ground beneath Sam shook violently, and the trees twisted and contorted as if in pain. From the shadows, more figures emerged, twisted, misshapen forms that seemed barely tethered to reality. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and their movements were erratic, almost insect-like. Sam didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, the key lighting his way as he weaved through the tangled trees. The creatures gave chase, their guttural growls and distorted shrieks filling the air. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. The forest seemed endless, the path before him twisting and shifting as if it were alive. And then, just when he thought he couldn't run any farther, he saw it, a clearing up ahead, bathed in a faint golden light. He pushed himself harder, the creatures closing in, their claws raking at the air just inches from his back. Sam burst into the clearing, the creatures stopping abruptly at its edge as though an invisible barrier held them back. They howled in frustration, their forms flickering and distorting, but they didn't cross the threshold. The golden light surrounded Sam, warm and soothing, and the key in his hand glowed brighter than ever. The creatures retreated into the shadows, their howls fading into the distance. Sam collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The clearing was silent, peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just escaped. But as his breathing slowed, he realized he wasn't alone. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, a woman, her form shimmering with the same golden light. Her face was kind but sorrowful, her eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed to pierce through Sam's very soul. You've come far, she said, her voice soft but strong. But the path ahead is fraught with danger. Sam struggled to his feet, the key still clutched tightly in his hand. Who are you? What is this place? The woman smiled faintly, but her expression remained somber. I am a guide, nothing more. The forest is a reflection of your soul, its trials the echoes of your fears. But you are not alone, Sam. Not anymore. What does that mean? He asked, his voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she gestured toward the far end of the clearing, where another path awaited, shrouded in mist. The answers you seek lie ahead. But be warned, the truth is not always kind. Sam stared at the path, his stomach knotting with dread. He didn't want to go, but he knew he had no choice. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, the woman's words echoing in his mind. The key is both your weapon and your curse. Use it wisely. The mist curled around Sam's feet as he stepped onto the new path, its damp chill sinking into his skin. The faint golden light from the clearing faded behind him, leaving only the weak glow of the key to light his way. The air here was different, thick, oppressive, and filled with an unnatural silence that made every sound he made seem amplified. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he pressed forward, the key pulsing faintly in his hand. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted his movements. He tried to focus on the path ahead, but his thoughts were a chaotic swirl of questions and fears. What was this place? Who were those creatures? And what had the woman meant by calling the key both a weapon and a curse? The path began to narrow, the mist thickening until it became a suffocating veil. Shapes moved within it, shadowy figures that seemed to watch him but kept their distance. Their presence sent chills racing down his spine, but he pressed on, determined not to show fear. Then a voice broke the silence. Sam. He froze. The voice was soft and familiar, carrying a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the cold around him. He turned, his eyes scanning the mist. "Sam," the voice called again, closer this time. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The mist parted slightly, revealing a figure. It was a woman, her features hazy and indistinct, but Sam recognized her instantly. "Mom?" His breath caught in his throat. She looked exactly as he remembered, her gentle smile, the way her hair framed her face, but something was off. Her eyes, though kind, held a sadness he couldn't place, and her movements were too smooth, almost unnatural. "Sam," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've come so far. I'm so proud of you." Sam's grip on the key tightened. You're not real. You can't be." Her smile faltered and she stepped closer. "I'm as real as you need me to be." "Well, Sam, you've been through so much. Let me help you." He took a step back, shaking his head. "This is a trick. It has to be." Tears welled in her eyes. "Is it so hard to believe that I'm here for you? That I've been watching over you all this time?" Sam's mind raced. It was impossible. His mother had died years ago. He had seen her body, attended her funeral. And yet, standing before him, she seemed so real. "Prove it," he said, his voice cracking. "If you're really her, prove it." She hesitated, her expression pained. "Sam, don't do this. Don't push me away." "Prove it," he shouted, the sound echoing through the mist. Her form flickered, the edges of her body distorting like static on a screen. For a moment, her expression turned cold, her smile twisting into something cruel. "You always were stubborn," she said, her voice losing its warmth. Sam stepped back, his heart pounding. "What are you?" The figure's form began to change, growing taller and more menacing. Her features melted away, replaced by a blank, featureless face. Her arms elongated, her fingers sharpening into claws. "I am what you fear most," it said, its voice now a guttural snarl. Sam didn't wait for it to attack. He turned and ran, the key flaring in his hand as the creature gave chase. Its footsteps were unnaturally loud, echoing through the mist as it closed the distance between them. The path twisted and turned, but Sam didn't slow down. His lungs burned, his legs screaming in protest, but the fear driving him forward was stronger than the pain. The key grew hotter in his hand, its light pulsing more intensely. He glanced back and saw the creature gaining on him, its elongated limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. "No," he shouted, gripping the key tightly. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't stop. Then, without warning, the path ended. Sam skidded to a halt, nearly tumbling over the edge of a massive chasm. The mist parted slightly, revealing a sheer drop into darkness below. Across the chasm was another path, but the gap was far too wide to jump. The creature slowed, its distorted form towering over him. It let out a low growl, its empty face tilting as if studying him. Trapped, Sam looked at the key in his hand. It was glowing brighter than ever, the heat almost unbearable. Instinctively, he raised it, pointing it toward the creature. A beam of light shot from the key, striking the creature and sending it staggering back. It let out a deafening shriek, its form writhing as though being torn apart. But the beam wasn't enough to destroy it. The creature steadied itself, its growl deepening. Desperate, Sam looked back at the chasm. The key pulsed again, and he felt a strange pull toward the void below. "No way," he muttered. "You've got to be kidding me." The creature lunged, its claws outstretched. With no other option, Sam jumped. The sensation of falling returned, but this time it was different. The key's light surrounded him, protecting him from the crushing darkness. The chasm seemed to stretch endlessly, but he didn't feel afraid. Finally he landed, the impact jarring but not painful. He opened his eyes and found himself in a new place, a vast, open field under a blood-red sky. In the distance, he saw a massive structure, a towering fortress that seemed to hum with an ominous energy. The key pulsed, pointing him toward it. Sam sighed, his shoulders slumping. Of course, always forward. And so, with no other choice, he began to walk. The field stretched out endlessly, the tall grass swaying gently despite the absence of any wind. The sky above Sam churned with dark crimson clouds, crackling with occasional streaks of black lightning. The fortress loomed in the distance, its jagged spires piercing the horizon like monstrous claws. Each step toward it felt heavier than the last. The ground beneath his feet seemed alive, faintly pulsating in rhythm with his own heartbeat. The key in his hand guided him, glowing with an intensity that seemed to grow the closer he got to the fortress. But the unease grew too. The silence wasn't complete. Every now and then there were sounds. A faint rustling, a low growl, a distant scream. The kind of sounds that teased at the edge of perception, making him question if he'd heard them at all. Sam paused, glancing over his shoulder. The path he'd come from was gone, swallowed by the same shifting mist he'd emerged from. There was no turning back. "Keep moving," he muttered to himself, gripping the key tighter. The fortress was still miles away when the first shadow appeared. It wasn't a clear figure, not like the creature he'd faced in the mist, but a distortion in the air, as if reality itself was being bent and stretched. It flickered at the edge of his vision, vanishing whenever he tried to focus on it. Sam's pace quickened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The distortion grew more frequent, the air around him growing colder with each passing moment. Then he saw it. A figure stood ahead of him, partially obscured by the tall grass. At first he thought it was another trick of the light, but as he moved closer, the figure didn't waver or vanish. It was solid. "Hey?" Sam called out, his voice cracking slightly. The figure turned slowly and Sam's heart stopped. It was him. Not just a reflection or a doppelganger, it was him, down to the smallest detail. The same clothes, the same face, even the same look of exhaustion in its eyes. "What is this?" Sam whispered, taking a cautious step forward. The other Sam smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculated, and filled with a malice that made his stomach churn. "You think you're making progress," the other Sam said, its voice dripping with disdain. "You think you're getting closer to the truth. But you're not." Sam tightened his grip on the key. "Who are you?" The doppelganger tilted its head, its expression mocking. "I'm the part of you that knows how this ends. The part you keep pretending doesn't exist." Sam shook his head. "I don't have time for this. Get out of my way." The other Sam laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally across the field. "You think you're strong enough to face what's coming? You're not. You'll fail just like you always do." Something inside Sam snapped. "Shut up," he shouted, raising the key. The doppelganger's smile widened. "Go ahead. Try it." Without thinking, Sam thrust the key forward. A beam of light erupted from it, striking the doppelganger square in the chest. For a moment, the figure flickered, its form distorting and stretching like a shadow in a strong wind. But then it stabilized. The light from the key faltered, and the other Sam laughed again. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't something you can fight. It's something you have to face." Before Sam could respond, the doppelganger lunged at him, its hands clawing for the key. The two of them collided, the force of the impact knocking Sam to the ground. The doppelganger pinned him down, its face inches from his own. "You can't run from this," it hissed. "You can't run from me." Sam struggled, his free hand fumbling for the key. The doppelganger was stronger, its grip like iron, but Sam refused to give up. With a surge of desperation, he twisted his body, throwing the doppelganger off balance. He scrambled to his feet, clutching the key tightly. The other Sam stood, its expression twisted with anger. "You'll never make it," it snarled. "You'll never." Before it could finish, the key pulsed violently, sending out a shockwave of light that engulfed the doppelganger. The figure let out a guttural scream as it dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only the faint echo of its mocking laughter. Sam fell to his knees, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The key in his hand was glowing brighter than ever, its warmth almost comforting. "Face it," he muttered to himself, the doppelganger's words ringing in his ears. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew he didn't have time to dwell on it. The fortress was closer now, its spires looming larger against the blood-red sky. Pushing himself to his feet, he began walking again, the key guiding him forward. The ground beneath him started to change as he neared the fortress. The soft grass gave way to hard, cracked earth, and the air grew heavier, making it harder to breathe. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, but Sam forced himself to block them out. When he finally reached the gates of the fortress, he stopped, staring up at the massive structure before him. The walls were made of black stone, etched with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly with their own inner light. The gates were massive, towering over him, and carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when he looked at them too closely. The key pulsed again, and the gates began to creak open, revealing a dark, yawning void beyond. Sam hesitated, his hand trembling. He didn't want to go inside, but he knew he didn't have a choice. Taking a deep breath, he stepped through the gates, the darkness swallowing him whole. The air inside the fortress was thick with an oppressive heaviness that pressed against Sam from all sides. The darkness wrapped around him like a living thing, swallowing up the faint glow of the key. Every step he took echoed through the vast, empty halls, the sound reverberating like a warning. The walls of the fortress were smooth and unyielding, carved with bizarre, indecipherable symbols that shimmered faintly as he passed. It was as if the very structure was alive, breathing, watching him. Sam's heartbeat quickened. He could feel eyes on him, hundreds, maybe thousands, though there was no one there. The silence stretched on, broken only by his own movements. The key pulsed again, urging him forward, its light growing dimmer with each step. Sam's fingers tightened around it, almost as though he was afraid to let go. His mind raced with questions, but the answers were elusive, lost in the suffocating darkness. As he walked deeper into the fortress, the temperature began to drop. His breath misted in the cold air, and a faint chill spread across his skin. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, but it did little to stave off the biting cold. Then a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper, coming from somewhere ahead. Sam froze, straining his ears. The whisper grew louder, clearer. It wasn't words, just fragments of sound. A hissing, like air being forced through a narrow opening, followed by a low, guttural growl. His muscles tensed, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The whisper grew louder, now unmistakably close. The hairs on his arms prickled with a sense of impending danger. He wasn't alone. Sam didn't dare to turn around. He couldn't. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. He felt trapped, like a rat caught in a maze. The key in his hand pulsed again, its light flickering as if it too was reacting to the presence that loomed just out of sight. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. The sound was raw, primal, like something not quite human. The air grew even colder, and Sam's breath came in shallow gasps. He took a step forward, then another, moving slowly, almost cautiously. The key's glow became a beacon in the darkness, illuminating the path ahead, but the shadows seemed to grow thicker around him with each passing second. The whisper turned into a voice. "Sam?" He froze, the hair on his neck standing on end. The voice was low, distorted, almost as if it were being forced through a metal pipe. It echoed in his mind, filling him with an icy dread that clung to his bones. "Sam, it's time to face the truth." The voice was unmistakable. It was his own. He spun around, heart pounding in his chest, but there was nothing behind him. The hallway was empty, just as it had been moments before. Time to face the truth? Sam muttered under his breath, his eyes darting around the dark, oppressive space. What truth? A deep, mocking laugh filled the air. It was his laugh, twisted and distorted. "You think you know what's coming, but you don't," the voice taunted. "You think the key will save you? It's not your salvation. It's your curse." Sam's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" The voice only laughed again, a low, menacing sound that made his skin crawl. "Let me show you," it whispered. Suddenly, the walls around him began to shift. The stone seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, and the shadows twisted, becoming alive, reaching for him. The temperature dropped even further, and a bone-deep chill crawled up his spine. In the distance, a door creaked open, its ancient hinges groaning in protest. It was just barely visible through the shifting shadows, a faint outline in the darkness. "Go ahead," the voice urged. "See for yourself." Despite every instinct screaming at him to run, Sam found himself walking toward the door. The key pulsed again, its light flickering in time with his heartbeat. It felt like he was moving through water, each step taking an eternity, but somehow his legs kept moving forward. When he reached the door, it swung open of its own accord. Beyond it lay a chamber, dimly lit by a strange, flickering light that came from an unknown source. Sam stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind him. The air inside the chamber was thick and heavy, almost suffocating. He could barely breathe. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal was a mirror. But this wasn't any ordinary mirror. The surface of the glass was dark, like ink had been spilled across it, creating an endless void. Sam felt a strange pull toward it, as if the mirror was calling to him. Without thinking, he took a step closer. The moment he did, the surface of the mirror rippled, and an image began to form. It was him. Not the Sam that was standing in front of it, but another version. Pale, sickly, his eyes hollow and empty. The image moved. The mirror Sam raised his hand to the glass, and with a sickening crack, the surface rippled, distorting like water. Suddenly, the reflection reached through the mirror, its cold, clammy hand grabbing Sam's wrist. He gasped, pulling back, but the grip was unyielding like iron. "Let go," Sam shouted, struggling to free himself. But the reflection only smiled. A twisted, cruel smile. "You've been warned, Sam," it whispered. "You can't run from your destiny." The chamber grew darker, the temperature plummeting even further, and the mirror image began to pull Sam closer, its fingers digging into his flesh. "No," Sam screamed, trying to break free, but it was too late. With a sudden, violent jerk, the mirror cracked and everything went black. When Sam opened his eyes again, he was back in the hallway, his chest heaving with panic. His hand was empty, the key gone. In its place was a cold, empty sensation that gnawed at his insides. The key wasn't just a guide. It had been taken from him, and with it, his only hope. The fortress had claimed it, and with it Sam. Sam's pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out everything else. His breath came in shallow gasps as he looked around, disoriented. The walls of the fortress had shifted once again, their once solid stone now warped and flowing like liquid. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse with a life of its own, sending tremors through his body with every step. The key, the one thing he had believed would lead him out of this nightmare, was gone. It wasn't just gone, though. It had vanished as if it had never existed at all, slipping away into the shadows of the fortress. For a moment, Sam stood there, the weight of his helplessness settling over him. The fortress was alive. He could feel it, the beating heart of the place reverberating beneath his feet. The air was thick, suffocating, and each breath felt like it might be his last. He tried to shake off the dizziness, the strange, disorienting sensation that had settled in his chest. The reflection in the mirror, it had been so real, so tangible. The cold, clammy grip that had dragged him in, pulling him closer to whatever fate awaited him. He could still feel the imprint of those fingers on his skin. Shaking his head, Sam forced himself to move. There was no time to dwell on the nightmare. No time to question what had just happened. A sudden, sharp sound made him freeze, a low, menacing growl like the sound of something hungry. Sam turned, scanning the hallway. The shadows shifted around him, dancing in the flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. The temperature dropped, and he could see his breath now, clouding in front of him like mist. He wasn't alone. The growl came again, this time closer, louder. Sam's heart raced in his chest, his instincts screaming for him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped him. From the darkness, a figure emerged. At first, it was a blur, a shadow that seemed to melt out of the walls themselves. But as it grew closer, Sam could make out the details, long, ragged clothes that seemed to hang off the figure's skeletal frame, dark eyes sunken deep into their sockets. The creature's face was gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its mouth, wide and filled with jagged teeth, curled into a grin. "Lost, are we?" the creature rasped, its voice an eerie whisper that echoed in Sam's skull. Sam swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Who are you?" The creature tilted its head, studying him. "A question for a question. How fitting. But I'm not here to answer your questions, boy." It took a step forward, the floor beneath its feet creaking as if it were fragile. Sam could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and suffocating, pressing down on him. "What do you want?" Sam's voice cracked. The creature's grin widened. "Oh, I don't want anything. Not really. I'm just here to remind you of something." "Remind me?" Sam repeated, his throat tight. "Remind me of what?" The creature's eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. It stepped closer still, its bony fingers stretching toward Sam's face. He recoiled, but the creature's grip was quicker, catching his wrist in a vice-like hold. "I'm here to remind you of the truth," it hissed. "The truth you've been running from." Sam struggled, trying to free himself, but the creature's grip tightened, digging into his skin. "What truth?" he demanded, panic rising in his chest. The creature chuckled, a sound that sent chills down Sam's spine. "The truth that this place, this fortress, it's not a prison for you. No, it's a mirror. A mirror showing you who you really are. Every fear, every doubt, every part of you that you tried to bury. And now it's time to face it, Sam's mind raced, his body trembling with fear. No, no, this can't be real. It's just a nightmare. The creature's grin twisted into something darker. You can call it a nightmare all you want, but that won't change what's happening. You're here because you belong here. Sam's breath hitched as he realized the full weight of the creature's words. You've been running from yourself, Sam. You've always been running, it whispered, its voice oozing with malice. And now there's no place left to run. With a sudden, jarring movement, the creature shoved Sam backward. He stumbled, falling to the ground with a painful thud. For a moment, Sam just lay there, staring up at the ceiling as the creature's words echoed in his mind. He had been running, hadn't he? The key, the fortress, the mirror, it was all leading him to one undeniable truth. This wasn't just a place he had stumbled into. It was his own mind, his own fears, his own doubts manifesting before him. He had always been afraid of facing himself, of confronting the darkness inside him. But now there was no escape. The creature's laugh rang out again, and Sam felt it deep in his chest, like a warning. You think you're the hero of this story? The creature spat. There is no hero. Only what you make of yourself. Sam's mind reeled as the weight of those words sank in. He was alone in this. No key, no guide, just him. The creature stepped back, its eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Go ahead, it said, its voice dripping with venom. Take the next step. I'll be here watching. Just like everyone else. Sam slowly pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let this creature win. But where else could he go? With a final defiant glance at the creature, Sam turned and started walking down the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last, his body screaming for him to stop, but he couldn't. He had to face whatever lay ahead. He had no choice. The fortress, the darkness, the creatures, it was all part of him now. And it was time to find out what that meant. The hallway stretched on endlessly, a maze of shifting shadows and flickering lights that distorted the very air around Sam. His feet seemed to move of their own accord, pulling him deeper into the fortress toward the unknown. Every breath felt like it might be his last as he walked, the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. The creature's words echoed in his mind, relentless and suffocating. There is no hero. Only what you make of yourself. What did it mean? What had he been running from all his life? He wasn't sure anymore. The lines between what was real and what wasn't were beginning to blur. The fortress, this place that had become his prison, was beginning to feel more like his own mind. Every turn, every step, seemed to bring him closer to something he couldn't understand. The air was colder now, almost unbearable. His breath misted in front of him, swirling in the air like smoke. He pulled his jacket tighter around his body, but it offered no warmth. The chill seemed to seep through his very bones, like the darkness itself was trying to freeze him from the inside out. And then he heard it again. The whisper. It was faint at first, like a distant murmur, but it quickly grew louder. Closer. Sam? His heart skipped a beat. He stopped dead in his tracks, looking around in every direction. The whisper had no source. It was everywhere and nowhere, curling around him like smoke. Sam? The voice repeated, closer this time. Sam's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. He had heard it before. It was his own. But this time it wasn't the voice he recognized. It was distorted, warped, like something was trying to break free from his own mind. Who's there? Sam demanded, his voice trembling in the suffocating silence. Show yourself. For a moment nothing happened. The hallway remained as still and oppressive as before. But then the shadows in front of him began to shift, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was a man, but not a man like any Sam had ever seen. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that stretched too far, as though the bones were too long for the skin. His face was pale, gaunt, with eyes that gleamed like shards of glass in the darkness. Who are you? Sam asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure's lips curled into a grin that was more of a sneer, something twisted and cruel. I am you, Sam, the figure said, its voice like the rasp of dry leaves in a windstorm. Or rather, I'm what you've been trying to avoid, what you've tried to bury. Sam stumbled back, his chest tightening. No, you're not me. The figure took a slow step forward, its eyes never leaving Sam's. I am everything you fear. Everything you've ever wanted to forget. Sam's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. "You're not real," he said, trying to convince himself as much as the figure. "Oh, but I am," the figure said, its grin widening. "I've always been here inside you. You've just never had the courage to face me." The words hit Sam like a slap to the face. The truth, brutal and raw, stung him in a way he wasn't ready to admit. He had been running from the darkness inside him, the parts of himself he couldn't stand to face. But now it was here, right in front of him. The figure's eyes flashed, and suddenly, everything around Sam began to distort. The hallway around him twisted and writhed, bending like soft clay under the pressure of an unseen hand. The walls melted away, replaced by images, visions, of his past. His childhood home. His father's angry face. The girl he had loved, the one he had pushed away. The mistakes. The regrets. The things he had buried so deep in his mind, so deep in his soul, that he had convinced himself they no longer mattered. But now they were here, alive and raw, swirling around him like a storm. "No," Sam gasped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "This isn't real." But the figure's voice rang out again, louder now, as though it was all around him. "Isn't it? This is you, Sam. All of it. The pain, the fear, the regrets. You can't escape it. You can't escape yourself." The world around him continued to twist and stretch, each vision more painful than the last. The fortress was no longer just a place. It was his mind, his memories, his torment. The figure stepped closer, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the distorted landscape. "Face me, Sam," it said, its voice dripping with contempt. "Face what you've been running from, or you'll stay here lost forever." Sam's legs shook beneath him. The truth was suffocating, pulling the breath from his lungs. He didn't want to face it. He didn't want to acknowledge that everything he had run from had always been inside him, feeding off his fear, growing stronger with each passing year. But there was no other choice. He couldn't run anymore. With a deep, shuddering breath, Sam took a step forward toward the figure. It laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed through the darkness. "Finally," it whispered. "Finally you understand?" The figure reached out, its cold hand brushing Sam's cheek. The touch was like ice, sending a jolt of pain through his body. Sam gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay still. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly seeing himself. Not the person he pretended to be. Not the man he showed the world. But the person beneath the mask. The one he had buried so deep, afraid of what he might find. The figure's grin faded, replaced by something more somber. "Now it's time to make a choice," it said softly. "Will you embrace who you are? Or will you stay lost in this place forever?" The darkness around Sam pressed in tighter, threatening to swallow him whole. He took another step forward. The choice was his. The moment Sam made the decision to move forward, the world around him seemed to shift. The dark, oppressive walls of the fortress dissolved into nothingness, leaving him standing alone in a vast, open space. The familiar hum of fear that had clung to him since he arrived in this place suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Sam blinked, trying to make sense of the sudden change. The floor beneath him was no longer cold and slick with dampness. Now it was warm, almost inviting, like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. The oppressive shadows that had once followed his every movement now seemed to recede into the corners of the space, as if they were afraid of something. But Sam wasn't sure if that was a relief or something far worse. The figure was gone, leaving behind only the lingering echo of its words. "Will you embrace who you are? Or will you stay lost in this place forever?" Sam's pulse pounded in his ears as he looked around the space, feeling more alone than ever. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, that he was being observed by an unseen force, waiting for him to make the next move. The weight of the decision sat heavily on his chest. Embrace who he was? What did that even mean? Everything he had been told, everything he had believed about himself, it had all been a lie, hadn't it? He had run from his fears, buried his darkest thoughts deep in his mind, pretending they didn't exist. But here in this place there was nowhere left to hide. Sam took a deep breath, forcing his legs to move. There had to be something, some way out of this nightmare. He couldn't stay in this empty space forever. And yet, every step he took seemed to take him deeper into the unknown, further away from anything that felt real. His mind spun with questions, with doubts as he walked. What was he even looking for anymore? Suddenly, the silence was broken by a distant sound, faint but unmistakable. A low hum, like machinery in motion, vibrating through the ground beneath him. Sam froze, his heart skipping a beat. The hum grew louder, closer. There was something out there, something beyond this empty space. And then he saw it. A door. It had appeared out of nowhere, standing in the center of the space like an anomaly, a singular object in the otherwise empty expanse. It was made of dark wood, old and weathered, with intricate carvings lining the edges. Without thinking, Sam moved toward it, his hand reaching for the handle. But as soon as his fingers brushed the cold metal, the hum stopped. The air around him went completely still, and the door creaked as if protesting his touch. Sam pulled his hand back, startled. What was this place? What was happening? The hum returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. A deep, pulsing vibration that resonated within his very bones, like something ancient stirring in the dark. The door swung open on its own, slowly, as though it had been waiting for him all along. A gust of wind, sharp and cold, rushed past Sam as the door opened wider. Beyond it, there was only darkness, thick, inky blackness that seemed to absorb all light, all warmth. Sam could feel the pull, the tug of something powerful, something dangerous on the other side. His breath caught in his throat as he stood frozen, staring at the doorway. What is this? He whispered to himself. A voice, cold and familiar, answered him. It's the last step, Sam. The final choice. The voice was clear now, not a whisper, but loud and commanding. Sam whirled around, searching for the source, but the voice wasn't coming from anyone he could see. It was coming from within him, his own thoughts twisting into something darker. No, Sam said, shaking his head. I don't want this. I don't want to be here anymore. But the voice only laughed, soft and mocking. Too late for that. You've been here longer than you think, Sam. This place, this nightmare, it's always been a part of you. You can't escape it and you can't outrun it. You've made your choice. Now step through the door. Sam's chest tightened, the weight of those words crushing him. He was trapped. No matter what he did, there was no way out. But the voice was right. He had made a choice. The moment he took that first step forward, everything had changed. There was no turning back. With a shaky breath, Sam stepped closer to the door, his heart pounding louder with each step. The pull was irresistible now, like gravity itself was pushing him forward. He reached out once more, his hand trembling as it touched the cold metal handle. Before he could even think, the door swung open fully, revealing a passage that seemed to stretch on forever. The darkness beyond was absolute, and as Sam stepped forward, the light from the room he had just left seemed to die, swallowed whole by the void ahead. Sam, the voice whispered again, and this time it was almost a plea. You can't go back. There is no back. Only forward. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the world he had known. He was alone again. But this time he didn't feel the same crushing fear. This time he felt something else. A strange, almost calm acceptance. The path before him was unknown, but it was his to take. The fortress, the nightmare, the shadows, they were all part of him. And now there was nothing left to do but face it head on. Sam took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. It was time. Time to finally face the truth. Sam's mind raced as he stood in the darkness, his senses stretching to try and make sense of his surroundings. The door had disappeared behind him, leaving only an overwhelming sense of emptiness. It was as though he had entered a space between realities, where time didn't exist, and the only thing left was him and the fear that clung to him like a second skin. The air was thick with an unsettling quiet, so silent that even his breath seemed to echo in the space around him. It was a silence that held secrets, the kind of silence that made every small sound, his heartbeat, his footsteps, feel like a loud disruption to the stillness. Sam took a careful step forward, but his feet felt heavy, as though the very ground beneath him was reluctant to move. His eyes strained to see in the dark, but there was no light, no landmarks, no sign of direction. Only a vast, endless void. Where am I? Sam whispered to himself, though he knew no answer would come. The voice had stopped. The one that had guided him, taunted him, was gone. He wondered if it had ever really been there at all, or if it had simply been another trick of his mind, trying to convince him to continue down this path. But Sam knew better now. This wasn't just in his head. The chill in the air, the weight of the silence, the absence of any comforting familiarities, all of it was real, and he was alone. Think, Sam, he muttered under his breath. What do I do now? He tried to focus on what he had learned, the lessons the dark figure had tried to force him to confront. The words echoed in his mind once more. Face who you are. He closed his eyes, taking a steadying breath, and then opened them again. The darkness didn't change. It was still as thick and impenetrable as ever. Yet somehow he felt different, stronger, more aware of the choice he had made. But the weight of the decision still lingered, a heavy pressure on his chest. Had it been the right choice? Was this the moment he'd been waiting for? His thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound just on the edge of his hearing. It was soft at first, almost like the rustling of wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving toward him. His body tensed instinctively. His heart rate sped up, and his breath became shallow as he turned in the direction of the sound, trying to peer through the inky darkness. "Hello?" Sam called out, his voice sounding weaker than he intended. The words felt like they were swallowed by the void before they even reached the air. The footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. Sam's pulse pounded in his ears as he fought the urge to run, to escape whatever it was that was coming for him. But he stood his ground, knowing that running would only lead him further into the unknown. As the footsteps grew louder, Sam could feel the tension building in the air, like the very atmosphere was holding its breath. And then, just when it seemed they would reach him, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned. But this time it was different. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something else. Something watching. "Who's there?" Sam demanded, his voice trembling but strong. He was tired of being afraid, tired of running from the unknown. A soft laugh, low and guttural, drifted through the air, sending chills down his spine. "You think you have control?" the voice said. Sam whipped around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the vast emptiness around him. "You've always been afraid of losing control," the voice continued, its tone mocking. "But you never had control in the first place. This place, this world, it's all you. It's your creation, Sam. Everything that happens here, every choice you make, it's because of you." The words struck like lightning, jolting Sam's mind into overdrive. This place, his creation? No, that couldn't be true. He hadn't built this world. He had never wanted any of this. But then he remembered the way the shadows moved, how they followed him. The way the fears that had plagued him throughout his life seemed to manifest in real time, shaping the environment around him. Had he been creating all of this without even knowing it? "Stop lying," Sam shouted into the darkness, his fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't me. This is all a nightmare." The voice laughed again, a deep, resounding chuckle that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. "A nightmare?" the voice echoed. "No, Sam. It's reality. Your reality. The one you've been avoiding. The one you've been running from." Sam's heart raced, his mind spinning with the weight of the truth, the reality that was beginning to settle over him like a dark cloud. "No," he whispered, barely able to speak the words. I don't want this." But the voice, relentless and cruel, pressed on. "Want it or not, Sam, it's already yours. It always has been." The darkness around him began to shift, to warp and twist, as if reacting to the very emotions swirling inside him. A light flickered. Sam blinked, squinting as he tried to focus on the faint glow. Slowly, cautiously, the light began to grow stronger, brighter. It was warm, inviting, drawing him toward it like a magnet. Without thinking, Sam took a step forward, his body moving toward the light, the flickering warmth that seemed to promise safety. But as he drew closer, the light revealed something he had not expected. A mirror. A large, ornate mirror framed in dark, twisted wood. It stood alone in the center of the space, its surface glistening with an unnatural shine. Sam stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He had no idea what he would see in the reflection, but he couldn't stop himself from looking. He stepped closer, his hands trembling as he reached for the cool surface of the mirror. And then, as his reflection came into view, he realized something. It wasn't just his reflection. It was him. But not the person he had come to know. This was a version of Sam he had never seen. A version of himself that was darker, more twisted, and far more powerful than anything he could have imagined. And it was staring right back at him. Sam's heart thudded painfully against his chest as his reflection in the mirror stared back at him, unblinking and unnervingly calm. The figure in the mirror wasn't exactly him, but it wasn't entirely different either. It wore his face, his eyes, his body, but there was something cold, something ancient in those eyes. They were empty, hollow, devoid of any warmth or humanity. The reflection didn't smile, didn't frown. It simply watched him with an intensity that sent a shiver crawling up Sam's spine. His breath caught in his throat, and for a brief, fleeting moment he thought about turning away, to run, to escape this nightmare. But something kept him rooted in place. The reflection reached out, its hand moving toward Sam's own, and for a moment, Sam felt the urge to mirror the gesture, to touch the glass, to confront this dark version of himself. But he hesitated. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely a tremor. "Who are you?" The figure in the mirror didn't respond verbally. Instead, it mimicked his every move like a twisted version of a dance. Sam raised his hand slowly as though in a trance, and the reflection did the same. But as his fingers pressed against the cold surface of the glass, a shock of electricity jolted through him, and he pulled his hand back with a sharp gasp. The reflection's hand remained, pressed flat against the mirror. It seemed to smile then, a faint, cold smile that sent a surge of fear crashing through Sam. "You've already met me, Sam," the reflection said, its voice echoing in the air. It was calm, calculated, yet it carried an unsettling edge that made Sam's stomach churn. "You know who I am. We are the same. You've been running from me your entire life." Sam recoiled, shaking his head in disbelief. "No, you're not me. You can't be." But as the words left his mouth, Sam felt a strange tugging sensation in his chest, as though the mirror was pulling at him. He stepped back, his mind racing. Could it be true? Could he have been hiding from this darker version of himself for all this time? The reflection in the mirror tilted its head as if it could read his thoughts. "You've always feared the truth, Sam. You've run from the darkness in your own heart, pretending it didn't exist. But it's always been there, just beneath the surface, waiting to come out." The words struck like a hammer. Sam's breath quickened, his mind spinning. He had always thought of himself as good. He had always tried to be kind, to be noble, to be strong. But deep down, there had always been something darker, something that lurked beneath the surface. He could feel it now, creeping up his spine, whispering to him, calling him toward the abyss. "Stop it," Sam muttered, shaking his head again as if he could shake the words away. But the reflection's smile grew wider, more twisted as it spoke again. "You can't hide from me forever. I'm you, Sam. You can deny it, fight it, but in the end you will face me. You will face the darkness inside you." The room around him seemed to pulse with the reflection's words. The very air felt thick, oppressive, as though the world itself was reacting to the dark energy that Sam's darker self was releasing. Sam felt a tightening in his chest, a suffocating grip of fear. "I won't be like you," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll never be like you." But even as the words left his lips, doubt began to creep in. What if he was wrong? What if he had been running from his true self all along? What if this was the real Sam, and the man he had been trying to be, good, noble, righteous, was nothing more than a mask? The reflection in the mirror seemed to sense his weakness, for it began to change, shifting into something even darker, more monstrous. Its eyes grew wider, its smile stretched impossibly far, and its skin seemed to darken as though it was being consumed by the very shadows that had always followed Sam. "You can fight me all you want, Sam," the reflection hissed, its voice now a low growl. "But in the end you'll realize, you need me. You can't survive without me." Sam's knees buckled and he fell to the floor, his mind overwhelmed by the words. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at the twisted figure in the mirror. He didn't know how long he sat there, trapped in the grip of his own fear and doubt, but eventually something inside him stirred. He had to resist. He couldn't let this dark reflection take over. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about facing the truth, about accepting himself, both the good and the bad. The reflection in the mirror twisted and writhed, but Sam didn't back down. He stared at it, his resolve hardening with every passing second. "You don't control me," Sam said, his voice growing stronger. "I will face you, and I will defeat you." The reflection froze, its eyes narrowing. It had heard the challenge in his voice, and for a moment, it seemed almost wary. "You think you can defeat me?" the reflection sneered. "You can't defeat what is already a part of you." "I don't need to defeat you," Sam said, his voice steady now, his fear beginning to fade. "I just need to accept you." The mirror cracked. A sharp sound, like breaking glass, echoed through the space. The reflection screamed, its form distorting and fracturing as the cracks spread across the surface. The mirror shuddered violently, and for a moment, Sam thought he would be sucked into the broken pieces, consumed by the dark version of himself that had always lingered in the shadows. But instead, the mirror shattered completely, the pieces falling to the floor in a cascade of broken glass. And in that moment, Sam felt something shift. The oppressive weight of the darkness lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sam felt free. But was it truly over? Or was this just the beginning? The pieces of the shattered mirror lay scattered on the ground, the fragments glittering like broken stars in the suffocating darkness. Sam's breath was ragged as he stood amidst the debris, his heart still racing, his mind spinning. He had faced the reflection, faced the darkness that had always lived within him, and he had chosen not to fight it but to accept it. And for a moment it felt like a victory. But as the silence enveloped him once more, a deep, gnawing feeling began to settle in the pit of his stomach. Had he truly won? Or had he merely made peace with something he couldn't escape? Sam took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning the darkness around him. There were no more voices, no more whispers, just an eerie stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive weight that he couldn't shake. He wanted to believe that it was over, that the nightmare had ended, but something told him that the worst was yet to come. With a slow, deliberate motion, Sam reached for the fragments of the mirror scattered around him. He picked up one of the larger pieces, the glass cold and jagged in his hand. The reflection was gone, shattered beyond recognition, but its presence still lingered, like a ghost haunting the edges of his mind. As he stared into the broken glass, he saw nothing but fragments of himself, broken pieces of who he had been and who he had become. "What now?" he whispered to no one, his voice hollow, lost in the void. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. At first, it was just a shadow, a figure, or perhaps a trick of the mind. But then it grew clearer, more defined. Someone, or something, was standing in the distance, watching him. Sam's heart stopped. His blood ran cold as the figure took a slow, deliberate step toward him. It wasn't the dark reflection this time. It was a woman. Her features were pale, ghostly, almost translucent in the dim light. She was tall, her long flowing hair hanging loosely around her shoulders, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural, otherworldly light. "Who are you?" Sam asked, his voice trembling as he took a cautious step back. The woman didn't speak. She simply stood there, her gaze fixed on him as though she were studying him, evaluating him. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of the situation. Had he truly left the nightmare behind? Or was this just another manifestation of the darkness he had confronted? The woman took another step forward, her movement eerily graceful. I don't want any more of this," Sam said, his voice breaking as fear once again gripped him. "Please just let me go." The woman tilted her head slightly as though considering his words. Then her lips parted and in a soft, almost melodic voice she spoke. "You have already chosen, Sam." Her words sent a shiver through him, and for a moment he felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared, and he was falling into an abyss. What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She stepped closer, and the air around her seemed to hum with energy. Sam's instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, unable to move. "You made the choice," she said, her voice barely audible now. "You accepted the darkness within you. You embraced it." Sam felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. The fear, the doubt, the realization all hit him at once. "I didn't want to," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I didn't choose this." The woman's expression softened, but there was no kindness in it. "You did, Sam. Whether you knew it or not, you've always known. The darkness inside you was never a separate thing. It was always a part of you. A part you refused to see, to accept." Her eyes glowed brighter, and Sam felt as though they were boring into his very soul. "But now," she continued, her voice low and soothing, "now you are free. Free from the illusion of control. Free to embrace who you truly are." Sam took a step back, his mind reeling. He couldn't understand what she was saying. How could this be freedom? How could accepting the darkness within him ever be a choice he could truly make? He wanted to argue, to deny her words, to refuse to believe that the only way to escape the nightmare was to surrender. But deep down he knew that she was right. The mirror had shown him the truth. It wasn't just the darkness he had been running from. It was the truth about himself, about who he had always been even when he tried to hide it. And now it seemed there was no turning back. The woman's smile deepened as though she could sense his realization. "It's not over, Sam," she said, her voice carrying a hint of finality. "This is just the beginning." The world around him began to shift once again, the darkness growing thicker, heavier, as if it was alive, reacting to the weight of his acceptance. "Goodbye, Sam," the woman whispered. And with that, she vanished into the shadows. The darkness grew colder, more oppressive, and Sam was left standing alone in the broken silence. He wasn't sure what had just happened or what it all meant. But one thing was certain: he was no longer the person he had been when he first entered this world. He was something else now. And the true horror of it all was that he didn't know if that was a good thing or a terrible thing. As he stood there, alone in the void, Sam realized that the journey he had started had not been a path of escape, but one of transformation. He had faced the darkness, and in doing so he had become it.